Welcome to Radio Abundance, a podcast by YIMBY Democrats for America. It's time to build again, folks. Fascism never made America great, but when progressives build, that's where you'll find American greatness. Tonight's first guest is California Attorney General Rob Bonta. He's the first Filipino-American ever to serve as Attorney General of California, where he led the way in wielding the law to defend Californians from Trump and to ensure that California's cities can't weasel their way out of building housing. He'll be followed by United States Congressman from California, Robert Garcia, the first ever openly LGBTQ immigrant to ever serve in Congress. Congressman Garcia is also the founder of the first ever bipartisan Congressional YIMBY Caucus. We had a little something to do with that, as it turns out. Tonight's special episode features two trailblazing Californians, abundance Democrats working to defeat fascism and build America. We like that here.
You're listening to Radio Abundance, a podcast by YIMBY Democrats for America. Now let's get to the show.
Please welcome your hosts for the evening, Steve Boyle, Armand Domalewski, Elizabeth Markowitz, and Burhan Azim. And to kick things off, here's Steve.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I hate these guys.
Hey everybody, welcome to Radio Abundance. I am your host, Steve Boyle, and I am here with three of my co-founders from YIMBY Democrats for America. We have, as always, Armand Domalewski. Armand was the driving force behind YIMBYs for Harris and the origins of both YIMBYs for Harris and YIMBY Democrats for America. We have Burhan Azim. Burhan is a two-time successful startup founder, now a Cambridge City Councilor in Massachusetts, the youngest city council member in Cambridge's rich history, as well as a staunch YIMBY advocate. And we are joined today by another one of our co-founders, Elizabeth Markowitz, making her Radio Abundance debut. She's a co-founder of YIMBY Democrats for America, as well as our media and communications chair. Hey, Elizabeth, welcome to Radio Abundance.
Hey, thanks so much.
You know, we told on previous episodes a little bit of our origin stories, and we'd love to get to know you a little bit. So for everyone who's meeting you and hearing from you from the first time, we'd love to know a little bit about just who you are and how you got into the YIMBY movement and YIMBY Democrats for America and the push for progressive abundance.
Absolutely. Yeah. My name is Elizabeth Markowitz. I hail from one of our favorite sprawling cities of Dallas, Texas. I love to say that Texas is a great place to be a YIMBY and it's a terrible place to be a Democrat. So as a YIMBY and a Democrat, you know, it's an interesting life here in Dallas, Texas. My YIMBY origin story is that by nature, I actually have my bachelor's degree in social work. And my first job out of college was in child protective services, in investigations, investigating reports of abuse and neglect, and sadly removing children from their homes and putting them with relatives where we could or into foster care. And one of my biggest takeaways was that a whole bunch of those cases could have been removed if there had been more affordable housing. And so many of our cases, if mom could have afforded an apartment on her own, she could have left an abusive boyfriend. If family members could have afforded a larger home, they could have taken in some of these kiddos that were in the system, but because they couldn't take these kiddos in, so often these children ended up in foster care. And to me, that just seemed like such a pinnacle of government failure, where we had children that really didn't need to be in foster care ending up there because we hadn't built enough housing. So that's really what radicalized me, but I didn't discover YIMBYism until a couple years later in 2022. I was working for a consulting firm supporting Democratic candidates running for statewide and federal office. And one of them asked me to write a housing plan because housing polled as one of the number one issues in 2022. And I went down the rabbit hole of writing a housing plan, knowing very, very little about this and what housing policy should look like on the federal level. And I went in thinking maybe rent control, rent freezes. And then I discovered this idea of YIMBYism, and that so often the cause of our lack of housing is actually too much government intervention that makes it too hard, too difficult, too arduous to build housing. And so that's really how I stumbled upon YIMBYism. And that's when I became a volunteer with a local YIMBY organization here in Texas that's pushing for statewide reform. Then took on a paid position with that organization that I did for about a year. Now I continue to be a volunteer for that YIMBY organization here in Texas. We've got a couple bills in the Texas state legislature that we are pushing for to make statewide changes to our zoning laws. And then I'm also got involved with YIMBYs for Harris. And yeah, it's just been such an incredible movement to be part of. I feel like YIMBYs are some of the best people to hang out with. So if for no other reason, even if I didn't believe in the policy, YIMBYs are just some of my favorite people. We're solution oriented. We don't have much of an ego, and we're just a lot of fun. And so, you know, for any young people out there that want a way to get involved, if you're feeling discouraged in the second era of Trump, and you don't even know where to start, YIMBYism is a great place to start because you will make friends, you will go far, and you'll, develop these deep connections. So,
Speak for
yeah.
yourself, Elizabeth. My ego is massive. Everybody Yimby's for Harris is constant like, Harmon, he spent 3 hours doing his hair.
Hey, all those Twitter followers go to your head, but I'm looking at the hair and I think it's worth it. So
I'm actually really curious because the first time I've heard this story, what were when you're going down the rabbit hole of like learning about housing, what were some of the articles you read? Were there pieces that struck you and like what led you down there?
Yeah, I think there was a line that I remember from an article that specifically said, our problem with lack of affordable housing is kind of like a guy that keeps on hitting his thumb with a hammer. And then he goes to the doctor and asks, Doctor, can you prescribe me something for my thumb? And the doctor says, well, maybe stop, hitting yourself in the thumb with your hammer. And so that was like such a simple explanation of sometimes government is just doing a little bit too much. I think also, living in Texas, again, as a Democrat, I've seen the failures of Texas governance, but one thing Texas does tend to do pretty well is that they tend to get out of the way when it comes to housing, especially at the state level. Where Texas tends to fail is at the city level, in some of our big cities that have too many regulations around housing. So yeah, I think kind of my own lived experience in seeing, in so many ways, Texas sucks, but this is one area where they've kind of got it right and that they've made it fairly easy to build housing.
we're really honored to both be working with Elizabeth and to have her on the podcast. We have Elizabeth to thank for a lot of the amazing press that we've received, both for Yimbys for Harris and Yimby Democrats for America. We were a ragtag group of like-minded folks following Armand who just wanted to help Kamala Harris. And we were able to get picked up and covered by, Politico and Axios and the Washington Post and the San Francisco Chronicle, and got those lovely money quotes from the Wall Street Journal calling us Yimbicella and a breakthrough moment for the decade-old Yimby movement. So deeply grateful for Elizabeth's work there. Elizabeth, the story you told in your origin story and your work, it's both beautiful and totally heart-wrenching. I've spent some time working with the foster care system too in California. As part of my career as an artist and creative producer, I was able to partner with some foster care organizations, both to create some virtual reality experiences and 360 videos, as well as even like a sort of a experiential game concept and a kind of a tabletop board game, both designed to help them communicate the journey and the struggle of foster care kids to donors and to supporters. And it is horrific how underfunded and understaffed it is. The things that these kids have a legal right to, oftentimes only half of them can get it. There's just not enough people and resources to go around. It's really painful to watch that system not live up to the need. And it's painful, of course, as Elizabeth mentioned, to see the ways in which our housing crisis hurt families, hurt young mothers, hurt people who want to have kids, hurt people who do have kids, and hurt kids and drive people into needing that help and not being able to get that help. So we're deeply grateful by Elizabeth's work in that field and really honored by the story. Elizabeth mentioned she's a Texan. Armand and I are Californians, and so are our two guests today. We got a chance to sit down this past week with California's Attorney General, Rob Bonta, as well as Congressman Robert Garcia. They are very exciting to talk to. Both are two more young, abundance Democrats.
I just realized this is our double Rob header.
Our double Rob header. We had a Rob and a Robert, Bob and Bobby. Which one's Bob and which one's Bobby?
The two housing Robs, the two housing Bobs.
Yeah, can't be Bob Bonta, so it's got to be Bobby Garcia, which actually sounds pretty cool. Kind of sounds like a race car.
That is cool.
They're both very cool. So they are two young, forward-thinking Democrats. They are people of color. They are Californians. Robert Garcia is 47. Rob Bonta is 52. Neither of them look it. Rob Bonta is the Attorney General of California, and he has been ultra aggressive at holding cities and municipalities' feet to the fire on housing to meet state goals. You think often of California comes up here as lagging on housing in abundance, as a failure in some ways. Its failures are the centerpiece of Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's new book on abundance, and all of that is true. But if we're thinking about who our allies are here and who's working on this, Rob Bonta is not only forward-thinking but forward-moving and has been an incredible ally of the movement for YIMBY policies and for abundance. I mentioned in the interview coming up that he's not just the tip of the spear on these issues, he is the spear, right? His lawsuits are the sticks that are forcing places to build to meet state goals. And he even mentioned, and I've heard this from other places before, that sometimes politicians will confess they need him to be providing those sticks, because then they can say, hey, I'm not the bad guy. I'm not making this happen. The state is making me. And then privately they say, thank you very much. We need to build housing. Very thankful for Rob Bonta's work. He's also been extremely aggressive at suing the Trump administration and standing up to their violations of the law and their constitutional rights. You know, our twin missions are to defeat fascism and build America. So his work in standing up to Trump with lawsuits from California, and his work in standing up to cities in California when they don't build housing with lawsuits from the state, he's firing on all cylinders in those two areas that are key to what we care about. Congressman Robert Garcia is the founder of the first ever bipartisan Congressional YIMBY Caucus. He was a huge supporter of YIMBYs for Harris. He spoke at our first event. He sat down for an interview with us to help mobilize people at our phone banking events, where he actually broke the news about when the YIMBY Caucus would launch. And, you know, Armand and I got a chance to sit down really recently with one of his co-chairs for the YIMBY Caucus, Representative Scott Peters from San Diego, who told us that YIMBYs for Harris and our work was the direct inspiration for the YIMBY Caucus, that it wouldn't have happened without us. Essentially, that by lining up those speakers, by identifying them, by promoting them, and then even in the green room conversations and our kind of virtual backstage, these members of Congress suddenly went, hey, there are more of us than we thought. We believe in this issue. There's very clearly a deeply motivated and engaged and passionate and big and growing and mobilized constituency for this issue, one that can turn out 30,000 people for a political fundraiser live stream, one that can raise significant money for a Democratic presidential candidate and mobilize all these calls. Hey, there's something here. There's enough of us now identified that we can come together and we can start to make a difference in Washington at the federal level in a bipartisan way. There's a real constituency for this issue. And also they have our backs, and they are staunch Democrats and passionate progressives who can take this message to the rest of the party, who can say abundance, and specifically what we here call progressive abundance, is the road to uplift all of us and bring us closer to those progressive and democratic goals. Whether you're a centrist Democrat who wants to see markets work better, or you're a diehard leftist who yearns for a new FDR, who wants to see government take a better and bigger role in building tons of abundant public housing and subsidized and affordable housing, and knows that in order to do that and accomplish that and actually build that public housing, we need our cities and states to have permission to do that and make sure they can't be stymied every time they try it by neighbors who don't want shadows. So that's happening in Congress right now. We'll hear more from Robert Garcia about what they're doing now and what to expect over this year. And we had a big hand in doing that. So I'll just pause there and say congratulations, Armand, for kicking off that movement. And it led very quickly from a Twitter suggestion to the halls of Congress.
Well, I don't want to say I mean, I appreciate it, but really it's like, I mean, just seeing Elizabeth here, for example, reminds me of how much it was a massive team effort, right? Like, we wouldn't have gotten any of the press coverage for her work. And frankly, like, none of it would have been worth it if not for the YIMBY Cello label, and that would not have happened without Elizabeth. So,
Still proud of it.
yeah, like, I think one thing people don't understand who don't work in politics is like, they often think that like news coverage kind of just like happens in the ether, but it's a lot of work because journalists are very busy people. They have to figure out what to cover, and you have to be like, it's a combination of like, you have to be credible and honest, and when you provide them stuff that they might want to cover, you want to, you know, credibly deliver and say like, actually, this is enough blowing up smoke. This would be good for you to write about. And have trust and stuff like that. And so, yeah, like the YIMBY, all of these things build on themselves, right? Like 10 years ago, Sonia Strauss, a crazy math school teacher, walked into a planning commission, and then Butterfly flapped its wings, and then YIMBYs for Harris happened, and now there's a YIMBY caucus.
Like Armand mentioned, you know, YIMBYs for Harris took a village. YIMBY Democrats for America has taken a village. So many people raised their hands and stood up and worked on that project and made it the success that it was. And we are going to be looking to feature and shout out just more of those voices that make this a community and an actively growing community as the weeks fly by. Armand mentioned a misconception about how political journalism works, and I think that the thing that I think about on the topic of our little village is I think the biggest sort of misconception that I've thought about in politics over the last kind of 6 months of or 9 months of doing this with you guys is I think it's very easy to think that politics is this far off thing, and you have to be like elite and establishment to have any role in it, and it's distant, and you'll never be able to make a difference. And I want to emphasize again, we just talked about Yimbys for Harris leading to the first ever bipartisan Congressional YIMBY Caucus, and them working on the YIMBY Act and everything we're going to hear about from Congressman Robert Garcia. That it was an idea. It was a WhatsApp group. Then it was volunteers raising their hand and saying, how can I help? And some of those people knew the issues back and forth and had spent some time in this movement. And some of them were jumping in for the first time. I'd always wanted to jump into the space and had no idea that I could or that there'd ever be an opportunity. And amazing things happen when you raise your hand and say, I care about this. I want to help. I want to throw down. Here's what I can do. Let's get going. And I realized that too when spending a lot of time knocking on doors for the election. Politics is very social. If you think of, oh my God, as I get older, how the heck am I going to meet new people and make new friends? The thing about politics is everyone needs you. They need you so badly. Activists need you so badly. Elected officials need you so badly. They're just desperate for people who care and have passion and their own perspective and want to put in the work. I'll tell one story, which is that, very recently there was a YIMBY event that was a day of focusing on the housing element in California. And I remember inviting a friend who I knew cared about this stuff but wasn't in the movement. And he was like, well, it seems advanced for me. I don't think I'm ready. I'll work up to it. But meanwhile, some of the speakers presenting case studies, one of them was somebody who had shown up to public comment 2 months ago, gave a great comment. The leader of an organization said, hey, that was great. Can we talk? Can we work together? He started leaning in. He started to develop his voice more. He started to find stuff to do and ways that his passion and time could contribute. And, 2 months later, he was presenting on a case study to this audience. It is easy to meet people. It is easy to find an impact. It is easy to get involved and start to build your ability to get involved. And I would encourage folks at home, whether that's our organization, please reach out to us, team@yimbydemocrats.org, and let us know how you want to be involved. But whatever that is, people will respond if you just raise your hand and jump in and throw down. And I think that's really important to know, to demystify politics, to bring it closer to people, and to let folks know that you have a voice, not just in elections, but in this process all year round. On that note, actually, Burhan, real quick, I'm interested in, you told us a little bit about your origin stories last week, but how did you decide to run for office, and how were you able to get in politics in the first place? My understanding is that you were a startup founder. Obviously, you must have cared about these issues, but how did you first get a toehold in the world of politics and start to raise your voice? And how did you come to the place where you said, I'm going to start running for office? And how did you do that?
So I was very involved with housing policy. I had grown up like moving from place to place every year and cared a lot about housing stability and housing issues. I got into college and I'd grown up in a pretty conservative place. And so was excited to be part of a more welcoming community where I think I more naturally fit in Cambridge. And so I got involved. There's this quote in politics, every generation is invaded by aliens. We call them children. And I think it was very much of that moment for me where I made the mistake of showing up to City Hall once. And to me, like the city was full of apartment buildings, like it was beautiful. And the idea of allowing 4 stories for 100% low income buildings, no concerns about, these will be super expensive. And yet that was super, super controversial. And also, I think that, all residents have a voice, but you would also see that there was this very narrow demographic of people who would show up to city council and I would walk outside of city council doors and say, like, this is not the same city I see. And at that specific moment, besides the mayor, the next youngest city councilor was 53 in a city where the median age was 28. Even the median voter age was about 32. And so I thought there was an opportunity. I knew a lot of people around town. And the mayor thought that I was a particularly good advocate at that time too. So he encouraged me to run. And the first time, actually, I lost by about 100 votes. But then the second time, I won by 100 votes. So it worked out. And then I became our youngest city councilor. And last time, I passed this really big affordable housing bill that was like 15 stories in our corridors and very scary, and actually doubled my vote count. Actually, every election, I've almost doubled my vote count. And so it's been particularly exciting and fun to be here. And I'm honored that now I'm at a point where I get to chair the housing committee. I get to write all of our zoning ordinances. And that's been a lot of fun.
Amazing. Burhan, I'm curious who some of your kind of mentors and influences and like role models and forerunners were. I think of on the number one, you are very young and the youngest city council member ever in Cambridge. And I'm curious if there was anybody who kind of you feel like set a precedent for you. And likewise, as I think about our next two interviews with Attorney General Bonta and Congressman Robert Garcia, both are fairly young. Robert Garcia is Latino, Rob Bonta is Filipino-American. And I'm curious for you, Burhan, in terms of your background and in terms of Cambridge, if there are folks that kind of come to mind who maybe blazed a trail for you or that you saw as role models or people to emulate, or to what extent you kind of blazed your own path here.
So there's actually a really funny story here. In Cambridge, young people in general in local elections don't vote. The voter turnout for people who are under the age of 35 in Cambridge is around 20% of registered voters. Whereas for people who are retirees, it's 70%. So there's a huge voter turnout gap. I thought that I could dramatically increase it because in my age cohort at that time, which was 18 to 25, it was even lower. It was 7%. And I had one candidate in our city's history who had tried to run for city council before and had actually tripled the voter turnout. And I tried a lot of strategies and we were successful. But that candidate who ran and lost was Matt DeBorgelis, who was also an MIT guy who was trying to run for city council. And then he lost by 100 votes, the same way I did my first time. And then he founded Act Blue instead. And then later Meter GS. And so this hilarious story of this guy who I was copying. Later, I learned how big Act Blue was and everything like that. But it also gave me a lot of confidence that even if this didn't work out, I would be all right.
Burhan, it's been lovely to get to know you a little bit. And now that we've done that, let's get to know our first guest. He is the Attorney General of California. And next up is our interview with Rob Bonta.
Rob Bonta, California Attorney General, thank you for joining me today. As the reality of a second Trump administration takes hold, I know there is a lot of fear and anxiety, frustration and sadness, and I understand. Those feelings are natural and understandable. I'm here today to reassure you that in California, progress will prevail. No matter who is in the White House, no matter who controls Congress, in California, we will keep moving forward. As Attorney General, I will continue to use the full force of the law, the full authority of my office to address injustice, to stand up for all people, to safeguard reproductive rights, to advocate for more housing, especially more affordable housing for lower and middle-income families just trying to get by. I'll continue to take on greedy corporate giants and fight for more affordable gas and groceries and everything in between. I'm here to ensure every person, no matter how they look, how much money they make, where they're from, who they love, how they identify, or how they pray, can pursue their version of the California dream. A fair wage and good benefits. A safe and affordable place to live. We know what he's capable of. We know what plans he has in store. No matter who is in charge of the federal government, no matter what the administration has in store, California will remain the steadfast beacon of hope and progress it has always been. A constant, unwavering, immovable force to be reckoned with. We'll continue to be a check on overreach and push back on abuse of power, be the antidote to dangerous, extremist, hateful vitriol, be the blueprint of progress for the nation to look to. As is so often said, as California goes, so goes the nation. In the days and months and years to come, all eyes will look west. to us. And in California, they'll see we are still moving forward.
That was tonight's first guest, Rob Bonta. He's the first Filipino-American ever to serve as Attorney General of California, where he led the way in wielding the law to defend Californians from Trump and to ensure that California's cities can't weasel their way out of building housing. To kick off our interview, here's YIMBY Democrats for America Executive Director Steve Boyle.
Attorney General Rob Bonta, welcome to Radio Abundance.
Thank you for having me. Honored to be with you.
Let's start here. You know, everyone in this conversation is a Democrat, and I think it's fair to say everyone here is a YIMBY. So that makes us all YIMBY Democrats for America, and for us at YIMBY Democrats for America, you know, that means we have two missions, right? One is to build America, and the other is to defeat fascism. And it seems to me that those are also two of your top priorities as the Attorney General of California. So on the one hand, you know, making sure that local municipalities can't evade state housing goals and holding their feet to the fire so they actually build the housing. And then, of course, on the side of the law, standing up to Trump's lawlessness and his campaign of chaos and destruction, along with your fellow attorneys general across the country as that first line of defense, and with California as a key battle. You know, Armand and I are both Californians. You're mobilizing to protect the people of California. So tell us a little bit about your work these days. So how are you making sure California builds housing, and how are you defending California from Trump?
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate the frame there. And definitely two top priorities right now. Absolutely on the Trump side of the equation, we're standing up for the rule of law, making sure that we have a presidential administration who doesn't break the law or violate the Constitution. Unfortunately, they are doing that regularly at a clip of once a week. We have 9 lawsuits in 9 weeks. And we don't want to bring any lawsuits because that would mean that the Trump administration is following the law. But each and every time they break the law, violate the Constitution, we'll take them to court to hold them accountable. Not a lot to ask that the President of the United States follow the law. Important to our democracy that he do so. And unfortunately, he's not. It's something that we saw in Trump 1.0, seeing it again here in Trump 2.0. Trump 2.0 is a little different in terms of the higher volume of actions, a lot of flood the zone strategy, chaos and confusion, shock and awe, and trying to overwhelm the opposition. But we have, every time we've seen them break the law, we've taken them to court. We have been successful in 85% of our cases, in defining success as winning a court order, at least preliminarily, in the form of restraining order or preliminary injunction. And we'll continue to do that, whether it be a act by the Trump administration that unlawfully tries to strip away birthright citizenship or pause funding for critical essential services for our states, or tries to give the richest man in the world and private citizen, by the way, access to American sensitive confidential information like social security number, bank account. We'll be there every time. That's our role when it comes to the federal government. We're also, of course, continuing to do all the important work in our states, in our state that's always mattered, and very important in that among those issues has been housing. And we want to build more housing in California. We want cities to build more housing in California. We have always said that we have a collective problem. It's shared by all of us. We need to build 2 to 3 million more units of housing as soon as possible. And certainly by 2030 is the goal, and we're not on pace to do it. And so every local jurisdiction must participate in the solution. No one needs to do everything, but every local jurisdiction needs to do something. They need to build some housing in their city. And they're not pro-housing if they say that they want more housing, but just not in their city. We have to build it in our cities and participate. We have the regional housing allocation, that regional housing needs allocation, RHNA numbers, which sets forth the amount of housing for every jurisdiction. We have housing elements that are required to be certified so that they provide a plan to build that housing that is required from each jurisdiction, and then they need to build it. And some cities are fighting the law and violating the law blatantly. And we don't wish to bring any lawsuits. We just want the housing built. We'll work with any city that wants to collaborate with us regarding how to get there and what the pathways are. But if they're going to brazenly and blatantly violate the law, like some cities have done, Huntington Beach comes to mind, we will take them to court and we will win. And we have won consistently here. The housing laws at the state level have been increasingly less patient with NIMBYism and have created more pathways for streamlined or by right housing, and if certain conditions are met. And there's no discretionary denial of housing in some of those cases. And we've seen a whole gamut of attempts to resist these actions. One of them, quite notable at the city of Woodside, right after we set up our housing justice unit, they self-proclaimed themselves a mountain lion sanctuary. So they didn't have to build the housing that was required under the law. So we told them they were not a mountain lion sanctuary and they needed to build the housing. And they said, okay, you're right. And we got that turned around in about 24 hours. But I think our presence as an attorney general's office that is focused on housing, I don't think the attorney general has been known for this. I want to be known for this because it's important. It's one of the top issues, if not the top issue in California: affordability, access to the dream of home ownership, just having affordable housing. And we're known for being the chief law enforcement officer, the top cop. But I also want to be the top housing cop because we have laws that need to be followed. They will help us build the housing that we need here in California.
Speaking of the litigation, you've started, I remember Huntington Beach was one of the earliest cases. You hit the ground running when you became AG and was already suing cities to make sure they build housing. And it's been a few years now. I'm wondering have you seen the legal strategies evolve over time? Have you been taking on, have cities been trying to do something different, or they sort of doing the same thing? Or how has that legal battle evolved in the last few years?
The most notable thing from the early lawsuits and the public action that we took, and the firm and aggressive action in furtherance of existing housing laws in California, led to a broader realization among local jurisdictions and cities that someone is watching, that these laws aren't just gathering dust on a shelf somewhere and you can follow them if you want or not follow them if you don't want. They saw that there's enforcement behind them. Someone's looking at the actions that the cities take, the projects that they deny, the projects they approve, the laws that they follow, the laws that they violate, and are taking action accordingly. So that was something that we saw. We saw that in conversations in public session from the dais on city councils, when council members were saying, I know that there's some desire on this council and perhaps even in this room in City Hall to not support a certain project, but we will get sued by the Attorney General if we don't follow the law. And so whether we want to or not is not the question. The law requires it, so we must. And that was a good sign. We saw that in some meeting minutes as well, references to us. I had some city council people tell me that the politics are difficult in their city, and being able to blame me, the Attorney General, as someone who's going to come sue them if they don't do the right thing and follow the law, is helpful for them to get the thing done that they know needs to be done, but may be politically difficult. So that was some of the upshot we saw originally. We were grateful for that. We don't want to bring a lawsuit against every city that violates. We don't want anyone to violate, and we want cities to follow the law broadly. And so getting the message out that we're watching, that there would be consequences and accountability if folks don't follow the law, was helpful. We saw a number of different efforts at the beginning to try to avoid the laws of the state of California to build more housing. The self-declaration of a mountain lion sanctuary was one. We saw some historical landmark designation as another. We saw some urgency ordinances be brought to immediately stop some compliance with housing, and we struck those down right away. There needs to be a articulated harm to public health in order to have an urgency action instead of a normal noticed action that provides opportunity for comment and input. We have Huntington Beach that just wants to say we can do what we want as a charter city, and you can't tell us what to do, and we'll take you to federal court on sort of the big theory, that the big swing for the fence, that all of these laws are violation of local control rules. And that was, we won in court on that already. That case was DOA, but they wanted to try it and exercise every level of appeal to delay and slow things down and drag their feet. So we've seen the gamut. And and we've seen it from blue cities, red cities. There's nothing political, particularly about this. There's a lot of jurisdictions that unfortunately are not participating in the solution. But we've brought a whole set of cases on a whole number of issues, and generally have been victorious in nearly all of them, creating good case law and a clear sense, I think, in the state of California that however it was in the past, it's a new day. We need to build. It's good for all of us. We're all in this together. Let's all participate in the solution. If you build some housing and the city next door builds some housing and the next city builds some housing, then together we can build enough housing for all of us.
You mentioned earlier setting housing goals in reference to 2030. That's an interesting date, and it's one I think about a lot because it contains within it, as I'm sure you know, a bit of a looming deadline that connects the dots between building housing in California and standing up to Trump and defeating fascism. In my personal opinion, I don't think it is an exaggeration to say that building homes in California in the next 5 years has the potential to shape the fate of our nation for generations to come, if not for all time. Right now, as I'm sure you know, if our population trends continue in their current direction, once the 2030 census hits, which is a little under 5 years from today, California is set to lose 4 electoral votes. So if those trends continue, that means that Democrats could sweep the entire blue wall, could win every state Joe Biden won in 2020, in every presidential election in the 2030s. That's 2032, 2036, 2040, and we could lose all of them. It seems to me if we're locked out of power for a decade, if there is no Democratic president in the 2030s, we might not get another shot. We might not see another liberal or progressive president again. We might not see another free or fair election again. Now, there's a lot of reasons why folks in blue states, blue voters in blue states, oppose housing. And we know these have devastating effects, but they at least reflect rational preferences, right? But it also seems to me that the stakes have changed. And so those fears we hear about, fears of shadows and taller buildings, fears of new neighbors who are maybe too rich or too poor for your vision of your neighborhood, that those fears now pale in comparison to the fear of God we all should feel about Democratic voters in Democratic states making choices that pave the way for a permanent MAGA Trumpist rule, which is perhaps what lies ahead if states like California, states like New York don't surge their population before that 2030 census. And I'm curious from your end, and especially since November, how those electoral stakes and the looming census affect the calculation around housing.
Adds a completely different dimension of urgency. Obviously, as you've mentioned, the thought that California could lose 4, maybe 5 congressional seats is a major problem. The fact that we are losing people from our state because of affordability obviously is not something that's acceptable. And there's been much talk about the wealthy leaving, rich people leaving California. There are some who are looking for different tax scenarios for their own personal situation. But a lot of the data really shows that it's more of a middle class migration, that people are losing because they can't afford to live here. And that completely aligns with anecdotal evidence and common sense when it comes to the costs here in California, whether it be the cost of groceries or gas, eggs, healthcare, housing. Housing obviously one of the the most expensive costs in any person's life, and we want to spend no more than 30% of our income if we can, and Californians up and down the state are spending much more than that. And we need to tackle housing affordability if we're going to create access to the dream of home ownership, the dream of living in California and staying here and being successful and having our kids buy a home. I have 3 children. I don't know how they're going to buy a home or where they're going to buy a home in California. And I'm not alone when it comes to that. People are being pushed out of their neighborhoods where they've been for generations because of cost. And of course, yes, we're losing population, and that has political consequences that are not good. So we're seeing some really important discussions from our top leaders. Governor Newsom among them, the Assembly Member Buffy Wicks of the world and the Senator Scott Wieners, that are really pushing us. And the world has changed in a short time, I want to say. And I say this with great admiration and respect to the YIMBY movement. Not long ago, just over a decade ago, you'd go into city councils and it was all NIMBY all the time. And folks who wanted to build housing were shouted down and attacked and silenced, and the NIMBYism ruled the day. And the rise of the YIMBYs changed everything. And the movement here in San Francisco and in the Bay Area and up and down California, and with great excitement, we all listened to candidate Vice President Harris talk about her YIMBY vision should she be president. That was exciting, and that provided another potential for a new chapter and even ongoing momentum and growth. And we need to ride that appropriate wave right now. It's a movement that meets the moment and the needs that we have, and the political consequences could not be more dire, as you say, and the everyday lives and livelihood of Californians is at stake and can be significantly improved if we can get housing costs under control.
How did you first come to the movement? Like, when did you hear about us? When did you start to think like, I'm a YIMBY?
Yeah, it evolved over time during my time at the Assembly. And it was, I'm from the East Bay, right across the Bay Bridge from San Francisco, which is the epicenter of a lot of the movement, and was adjacent to a lot of the leaders. Scott Wiener and I go way back. We knew each other before either of us were elected to anything. We're friends. We talk. I admire and respect him. His policy perspectives are very meaningful to me. I've served, next door to Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, California YIMBY. Brian Hanlon is based here in the East Bay as well. We have
He actually moved to San Francisco recently, but yeah, I know Brian. Yeah,
yeah. And there's SF YIMBY, there's YIMBY Action, there's it's all around us. Yeah. And seeing more courageous council members step up and push back against the NIMBYs. There was some policy diving for me to get into the policy, to get some depth and breadth and history and hearing different perspectives. But I don't know when it was. I don't know. It was the early days of the YIMBY movement, and I was going to events in San Francisco with Scott Wiener and talking about the deficit of housing that we have built. And I remember Scott once said, the way to build more housing is not make it illegal to build housing. That makes a lot of sense. And he's like, when we zone for single family homes, we're making it illegal to build multifamily homes. And there was a common sense in that. And also a beautiful embrace of, us and we, instead of I and me, the collective, our shared society, our common future. We need to build more housing for all of us. It's not, this idea that, your housing makes my life worse. It's our housing makes our lives better. And I think that's the right spirit and exactly what we need right now.
Yeah, you talk about the YIMBY movement a little, and it's really exciting to see how infectious that energy can be. And I'm curious what you need from the movement, and where folks who want to support the movement and further the movement, from your seat in government and in law, how can ordinary citizens be mobilizing? What do you need from us? Everybody listening out there who's wondering what their role in this is.
The engagement is so important, and everyone can be engaged and focused, in their own community. We all care about our communities, our neighborhoods, our neighbors, and folks who are active in their communities, pushing for more housing, involved in city council meetings, or passing measures or local charter amendments to build more housing, calling out violations from city councils who are not following state law, or when there's a housing element that's out of compliance. Like, that's all good stuff. Today, all you need is, your phone and yourself and your thoughts, and you can, share your reflections and be on TikTok and be on Instagram and be a voice for YIMBYism. And some, there's power in knowing that there's people that share the same view, the same set of values, the same set of goals and commitments. So folks can do that in their own communities. I would also say that helping the enforcers know what's happening on the ground is really important. We're a big department. We're $1 billion a year agency. We have nearly 6,000 employees, over almost 1,200 attorneys. and we don't know about what's happening on housing in every city in the great state of California. And when folks are able to share their concerns or flag an issue, it allows us to intervene early and hopefully avoid any problems with compliance with the law and any hindrances to building more housing. So, and if folks, have anything to share with us, you can go to oag.ca.gov/report, and our housing justice team can take the issue from there. But engagement is key. Staying active, democracy, the YIMBY movement, building more housing is about participation and engagement, activism. The enemy of the YIMBY movement and democracy is apathy and not being involved. So stay involved, stay vigilant, be committed in any way that makes you comfortable, including in your own community.
Speaking of helping you, right, there's like the movement, what the movement can do. And I was wondering if there's any legislation that's either currently being proposed or you'd like to see proposed that would help you do your job as AG. Because I know in previous legislative cycles, there were laws, I believe it was written by Assemblymember Haney. I might not remember exactly who, but that were, like, they worked with your office because you asked for another tool or clarification to the law that would make your work more successful. Could you talk a little bit about that and then about any future legislation like that?
Yeah, I was a former legislator for over 8 years, proudly so. I served in the California State Assembly, representing the great cities of Oakland and Alameda and San Leandro, and deeply believe in the ability of the legislature with the governor to solve problems. Not every problem needs a bill, but many can benefit from a good policy change, a good set of a new tool or a new solution. Some, of course, require enforcement of existing laws, and so I'm in the executive branch now, and I do a lot of the enforcement. But we have always tried to provide more tools based on our own, lived experience as an enforcer to help fuel the movement, the YIMBY movement broadly, the building of more housing in California, more specifically, the compliance of cities with housing laws, very specifically. And so I work with our colleagues, Assemblymember Wicks and Senator Wiener are always top of mind. Last year, we modernized the builder's remedy with Assemblymember Wicks to make those projects more feasible to approve and to build, to make it more clear that this is a real remedy. It does kick in. There is, and there's a way when a housing element is not compliant, where builders can build projects when they meet certain measurable standards. We also, with Senator Wiener, we realized that some of these cities were dragging their feet, and there wasn't enough teeth in the accountability. We needed more penalties earlier in the process, as soon as the violation occurred, that start running, to encourage to hold these violating cities accountable and to encourage them to comply, instead of just continue with the litigation and drag things out. And we created higher penalties, and those penalties go into a fund to build more affordable housing, consistent with the goal and the mission. So that was a good solution. This year we have a couple of new bills that we're sponsoring as well. One with Senator Arreguín in the East Bay, who took over for Senator Skinner. Another YIMBY here in the Bay Area, which provides some clarity around how getting voter approval interacts with some of the requirements that exist for cities to comply with housing law. Some cities want to send their housing element, for example, for voter approval, and we're making it clear that if it's not approved, if it's disapproved, then you're out of compliance, and the builder's remedy kicks in, for example. So and we saw some ambiguity in this space, so that's why we wanted to provide clarity. We also wanted to provide more speed. This idea that we need to make it easier to build the things that we want. We need to make it faster to build the things we want. If we want housing, we need to make it easier and faster to build. And that makes complete sense. That's, Senator Wiener's theory. That's Ezra Klein's theory. And so we have a bill with Senator Caballero to expedite judicial review of housing development permit denials, so that we can get to a final conclusion faster. And, the idea that time is money, especially for small builders that can't carry, that kind of burden, speed's important. So those are some of the things that we've worked on. And Assemblymember Haney, as you mentioned, has been a partner as well.
It's really thrilling, of course, to hear about all your work and your quite aggressive work on housing and on YIMBY issues. I think of you not just as the tip of the spear, but as the spear, right? And of course, we're not only YIMBY Democrats for America. The podcast is called Radio Abundance, and that is because we do believe in that movement more broadly and the idea of abundance as a civilizational goal and animating principle. And we want to put housing at the center, an abundance of housing, because that is most dire and urgent, but also an abundance of energy, of transportation, of infrastructure, of healthcare. So I'm curious, both in terms of your personal philosophy, how you think about abundance, and then how that intersects with your work as Attorney General.
Yeah, I don't know that I called it abundance, but in the past, but I've always subscribed to this idea that instead of fighting over a small pie, let's grow the pie for all of us, and create more opportunities for us all to succeed. And I've always said, let's reject the zero sum fallacy that my success requires your failure. And that we need to adopt this idea that you can succeed and I can succeed and we can both succeed together. And just because you succeed doesn't harm me. It's good for me. Our neighbor's success is good for all of us. And we need to create opportunities for us all to succeed. And that means having more opportunity and more resources, more housing, more transportation, more energy, all those things. So it's a frame I hadn't used, but it's an idea that I've subscribed to for some time, and I think it's the right way to live in community, to live in a United States of America, in a shared society. We share it, and we're all going to rise together or not at all. And we need abundant access to the things that are most important to our success. And so I like the frame. I'm so grateful that it's being that it's having its moment, and that it's getting into the ears and brains of policymakers. And of course, Governor Newsom and Ezra Klein had a wonderful conversation about abundance, and the governor double clicked on it and supported it, and is gave the book to the legislative leaders so that they could read it too. And that's good stuff. That's what great ideas are supposed to do. They're supposed to take root and turn into something tangible and concrete, into real policy, real change. And so, we're in this moment as Democrats where we're doing some self-reflection appropriately, looking at the last election, what went wrong, what's still right, what do we need to change? Are they transformational changes? Are they strategic tweaks? One of them is we need to deliver, and that's not new. I'm not saying that we haven't delivered, but the way to have people support you is to do things that make their lives better, not talk about it, do it. And so that it's concrete and tangible in their lives. Really make housing more affordable, really make eggs more affordable for people to come off the street who are homeless and into care where they're getting the treatment and support that they need. Really do it, not just talk about theories that may or may not work. And delivering has always been something I've cared about. I've always said every elected official needs to, at the very least, care and try. At the very least, but that's not enough for me. I think you need to deliver. You need to care, try, and deliver on the things that your constituents want or else need, or else, give someone else a chance in that spot. Because if you're not delivering, your constituents deserve better. So I think if Democrats can do that more broadly, and I know we can, I think we'll be much better off next cycle, and the people we serve much better off, of course, too.
Yeah, this is a major theme of the conversations that we've been having with folks, is the idea that Democrats need to deliver and in order to present a better alternative to Trump and to ultimately defeat him. We talked a little bit earlier about the electoral stakes of building housing in defeating Trump. But I also think a lot about the role of housing in both addressing the root causes that have empowered the rise of fascists, as well as in articulating that better vision, not just of democratic governance, but of a better world, of better states and a better country. And I'm curious how you see building housing fitting into it, but into that battle, yes, but also in terms of tackling its underlying causes and a model for a better choice we can make.
Interesting question about fascism, choosing democracy. I think if democracy makes people's lives better and it works for them, people will continue to choose it. To me, it's what we chose, and it's immovable to move off the path of democracy for me. But I realize that there are places where democracy has turned to fascism, where and autocracy. There's a movement around the world towards strongman, quote unquote, leadership. And it's a problem. It is exactly not who we are, and exactly not what our defining document, the U.S. Constitution, made us to be. The U.S. Constitution, in a word, the Cliff Notes version, the short form in one sentence is: America shall have no kings, no tyrants, no monarchs, no dictators. It is designed to never have that. So it's built for this moment where it's being tested, stress tested, and it certainly appears that this view of quote unquote expansive executive authority, where you're taking over the congressional roles and state roles and jurisdiction and authority, is a move towards potential autocracy, dictatorship, a third term, et cetera, et cetera. And so, if people feel like democracy is failing, that it's too slow and doesn't deliver what they need, and that their lives are untenable and they can't afford housing and they can't afford groceries, they'll look to an alternative. Maybe it's an alternative party. And that's what we saw, at least with the presidential election and some other races across the country. Or maybe it's a different form of government. But the bottom line is they will vote based on their quality of life. And I know we can deliver as Democrats. We have delivered on a lot of things. We need to talk about that more, toot our own horn, show the receipts, take a victory lap. That's important. But we also need to deliver more consistently and starting with the issues that are most important to our people and working our way down. Top priorities being cost of living, including housing. So if democracy delivers, democracy will be successful, and it will be durable, and it will have longevity. If democracy does not deliver for people, it's vulnerable and it's at risk.
Speaking of tooting our own horns, the Abundance book obviously heavily targets California, but as we know, you've been addressing these issues arguably ahead of the book. So I want to give you a chance to toot your own horn for a second. I'd love to know two things in both directions, right? One is, what would you like, Ezra and Derek to know about the work that you've been doing in California this whole time? And also, what have maybe you picked up, either from the book or the movement more broadly, that has maybe you think about things differently, or that you've been able to apply to the work or plan to?
Yeah, thanks. I think that my decision, immediately upon becoming Attorney General, to prioritize housing and to value housing and to plant a flag in the ground and say, I'm going to enforce housing law. And I'm going to fight for housing. And that's going to be a top issue for me. When no AG had ever really done that before, but is something I'm proud of. And I'm proud of, one, using the bully pulpit for an issue that I think is really important to Californians. I've always said, as a leader, my job is to not create priorities in a charting session in some office, frozen in a moment in time. That is static and never changes. But my job is to have priorities that match what the people want. So my fights, are Californians' fights. Their fights are my fights. Whatever is most important in their life is most important in my life and in my service. And so housing was one of them. And so I'm grateful that I was able to get a great team involved, an incredible leader leading that team, Alex Fish, who's a YIMBY himself.
So Alex Fish used to be in like a housing YIMBY group chat that I was on Twitter. So it was one of the saddest days for us when it was great for him, obviously, and great for the state. But he's like, guys, I have to, I'm going to get appointed to this. So I have to leave the group chat now.
Yeah. I mean, I hope that's seen as California's gain. I certainly see it as putting him in a, even a bigger role to affect more change and help more housing get built. And so, picking someone like him and, getting cities to build more housing, we think we've, along with our partnership with HCD, helped build 40,000 more units of housing that weren't going to be built. And so I think that's tangible, that's real. It also shows, I hope and believe, and I'm always bragging about California in this regard, a blueprint and maybe some inspiration for what other attorneys general could do or other enforcers can do. Even if housing doesn't seem to be something that has been historically part of an agenda or a set of priorities, it's what your people need. So make it a priority and do what you can to help build more housing in your state. And so I'm grateful for that. And I can talk about all the the number of pounds of powder and pills of fentanyl we've taken off the street, the number of organized retail crime groups we've taken down, hate crimes, human trafficking, the billions of dollars in funding for our opioid settlements as we've cracked down on the opioid epidemic and sued the bad actors, the corporate bad actors that we've held accountable. List goes on, and I'm proud of all of it. And we need to do more. And I haven't done enough. And I need to fight harder and be better. And that is a lesson that I've seen in Ezra Klein's book and Abundance. This self-reflection about, yes, California can be great. California exceptionalism, the fifth largest economy in the world, the greatest state in the nation, in my view, the most diverse state, the state that's led to the phrase, as California goes, so goes the nation. And it can have failures that need to change. And part of being great is being reflective of your own failure to meet the high standards that we have for ourselves. And we haven't met those high standards in a number of different ways. Certainly when it comes to building more housing, certainly when it comes to addressing homelessness, certainly when it comes to high-speed rail, much talked about by Ezra and by Governor Newsom, and rightfully so. Like that's a classic example. It takes too long. Do it faster. We need to deliver faster, and we need to deliver more. So this idea of don't get caught up in process so much, and don't get focused on the inputs. At the end of the day, it's the outputs. It's what you deliver that matters. No matter what the process is, no matter what the inputs, if you don't deliver on the outputs, then nothing else really matters. So I like that sort of aggressive set of metrics and firm set of standards that Ezra and Derek have projected on Democrats. We do need to have high standards, and we need to work harder to meet them.
One thing that Senator Wiener, I've heard him say a zillion times, I used to work for him. He'd say, well, people, it's good to have a process, but a process needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the way that things work right now is that there's never an end, right? People keep suing and keep suing. You saw some congestion pricing in New York that is like so many years. And even after it was implemented, there's still more lawsuits. And with, high-speed rail, a lot of people don't understand the money was spent on just like fighting lawsuits. In your position as AG, how do you think we can make it? Obviously, your job is to like win cases, and you're doing a great job at it. But how do you think the law can be shaped to sort of streamlined process in that way, so there aren't always more hooks for litigation? Like you talked about an example earlier of a city that like knew is going to lose, but still kept suing because it's worth it for them to drag things out, right? And like, can we change laws to not have that happen?
And we have changed laws to not have that happen, and we can do it more. And we, first of all, everything you said sounds like the wise Scott Wiener that I know. Congratulations on being able to work with him. He's full of wisdom and
he's
just
awesome. Yeah.
Fearless I have a statement about him that I call him the Terminator. He keeps coming until he wins, and he might not win this year, maybe even not next year, but he will get his thing across the finish line because he will not give up. And I have great respect for his push and his fearlessness. Process part of the journey is the end, and you need to get to the end. You can't be in an endless journey. You can't be in endless litigation. For some things, and I've been an author of a bill that did this. For stadiums, we have streamlined the CEQA process. We made it shorter. We created an end date by which the whole thing needs to be done. We did not change at all the thorough inspection of environmental impacts and the need to create mitigation, but it wasn't going to be in a lawsuit that goes on for years and years and years. It was going to be done in 9 months. And that gave certainty for the builders of the envisioned Oakland A's stadium in Oakland. And it was the same for other stadiums throughout the state of California. If we can do it for stadiums, why can't we do it for other things that we care about deeply, like housing? And the answer is we can. And so I support the substance of CEQA. Part of who we are in California is a state that loves and protects our environment. We're a nation and global leader in that regard. I'm also someone who thinks we can balance that with building housing and building things that we want if we do it fast, and if we create guardrails and streamlining processes. So making litigation shorter is very important, and we can be very specific about it. It'll all be done in 9 months, you can say, and then you need to support the court system and infrastructure to get it done and provide that track to go through from beginning to end in that process. But we can do that. Democracy is messy. We have different branches of government. We have power dispersed throughout those branches horizontally, throughout government vertically as well, federal, state, local, both city and county. We have private parties that can get involved with litigation like CEQA lawsuits, and that's all part of the process that we've chosen. We're not Singapore with a single person in charge who can say we're building 30,000 units of housing and it gets done immediately with no further discussion. We've chosen democracy, but democracy doesn't have to be slow, and it doesn't always have to be inefficient. We can do better if we hold ourselves to that standard. We can't accept this idea that it's democracy's messy, so it's going to be slow. Yeah, we might have a high-speed rail that takes 15 years to build or more. Unacceptable. We can do better, and there's ways to, and we have some models of things that have actually been done before that we might want to pull off the shelf and replicate.
That proposed stadium you mentioned in Oakland, just anecdotally, that was going to be gorgeous. I hope you're enjoying the A's in Sacramento, but one day we'll have baseball in Oakland again, and we will get that waterfront ballpark with a rooftop park. It's been a real delight to talk to you today. There are a few officials across the country who are as focused on our twin goals as we are in terms of building housing and defeating fascism, and we appreciate your work. And I want to end, on a personal note. Not my personal, your personal. You are the first Filipino-American, the second Asian American ever to serve as Attorney General of California. Your parents spent their lives fighting for social justice. You've talked about that as a key motivator for why you became a lawyer who could wield that expertise in service of people who needed defending. You've fought across your career for racial and economic and environmental justice. You've advocated for immigrants and renters and workers. You led the fight against racial profiling as a deputy city attorney in San Francisco. And I'm just curious, with all of that background, right? How does your background, your life, from race to culture to your parents and childhood to the experiences you've had and the fights you've taken on in government, how has who you are and what you've experienced shaped this push to build more housing?
And just before we begin, I want to say my partner is Filipina, and her entire family WhatsApp is very excited that I'm doing this.
I love it.
They are big fans.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate you saying that, and thank you for the talking about my background. I think who I am and my background defines how I am and how I see the world and how I fight and my theory of and vision of change. And with a father who was involved in the civil rights movement, marched in Selma, Alabama, organized for civil rights and voting rights. Both parents worked for the United Farm Workers of America. We lived in La Paz. I grew up there as a young boy. La Paz is the headquarters in the Central Valley. My dad worked in the front office with Cesar Chavez and helped set up healthcare clinics for the farm workers. My mom worked in the preschool with Dolores Huerta way back then in the early 70s. And then my mom, an immigrant from the Philippines, fought for the restoration of democracy in her home country for years and years until people rose up and chased out a dictator and brought democracy back to a country after the dictator was violating human rights and disappearing opponents and arresting, imprisoning, torturing, and killing them. And when I was just 2 months old and born in the Philippines, my parents saw that dictator rising to power, and they knew martial law was around the corner, which it was. And so they brought me to California because they thought I could live my California dream here and reach my full potential here. And they were right about that. They wanted freedom and democracy for me, human rights and due process and the rule of law for me. And I'll tell you, I know the California dream is alive and well because I'm living mine. I never thought I could be in this role. I never take it for granted. I'm always honored and grateful. Sometimes I don't even believe I am the Attorney General of California. So I will secretly confess to you that I will go on the website and see if my photo and my name are really there. on the DOJ California AG website. And I'm pumped when it is, because it means I can do what I love doing most, which is fight to make people's lives better, tackle these problems, serve other Californians and lift them up. And I believe that the way, because of my parents who fought against injustice and believe that when something's not right, it's time to fight, and believe that you can make tomorrow more fair than today. I believe that nothing's impossible for us, and that the role I have can help shape the change that we need. That just the fact that we haven't built housing for people and push this dream of home ownership and affordable housing out of reach for more Californians doesn't mean it has to be that way. It means it has to change, and I need to be part of that change. And so, my parents always taught me that the most potent power that there is people power, and that we can drive the change that we need. And so, the YIMBY movement is people power at its finest, also matched with folks with positional authority. And that's the magic, what I call the inside outside game, where you can do anything. When you have a grassroots, community driven, people driven movement combined with people in power who can make decisions, and they're working together, and they're singing from the same songbook, and they're have the same mission and goals, then it's blue skies and anything's possible. And I think that's where the current YIMBY movement is. And I saw my parents as everyday people ask elected officials to fight with them on the issues that they cared about. And I saw the disappointment when almost all the time the elected officials declined and were focused on other things. So I decided to run for office because I wanted to say yes to the people and be that person with the privilege of authority in an elected office who can help make the mission of everyday people, the fight of everyday people, into a reality. And so that's how I see the connection of my story, my origin story, if you will, who I am, who my parents are, their impact on me, connected to the work I do broadly and the work I do with housing. The idea that we must change and that we can change is deeply rooted in who I am. One of the things that my parents' participation and involvement with these different people power movements, one of the biggest lessons was that we have agency in what happens next. We don't have to accept the unacceptable. We don't have to normalize what's abnormal. We don't have to just take things that are unjust or wrong. We can change them, and we must change them. And so we have many more chapters to write in the story of California, the story of America, the story of housing in California, and the story of housing in America, the story of democracy in California and in America. And it's not Trump and his billionaire buddies and his the greedy corporations that he supports who's going to write it. It's going to be the people who always write it, you and me and us, the people. We are a nation of, for, and by the people, and we're going to write the next chapter, including building an abundance of housing for everyone who needs it in California and in America.
Well,
thank you.
Power to the people. Let's go write that next chapter. Attorney General Rob Bonta, thanks for joining us today on Radio Abundance.
It is my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Steve. Thanks, Armand. Honored to be with you.
That was California Attorney General Rob Bonta. Elizabeth, you're new for this podcast. Let's start with you. What'd you think?
Yeah, absolutely love that conversation. I think one thing that really hit me is how important it is for us to have strong YIMBY attorneys general. It's something that we don't often think about. We think about needing YIMBYs in our, state legislators and in our governors and our mayors, but we're not always thinking about that we really need some really strong YIMBY lawyers, and specifically as attorneys general, specifically in states like California that have, passed good laws, but still have cities that are, kind of trying to defy those laws to block housing. And so just how important it is for us as a YIMBY movement to be building up a pipeline of strong YIMBY attorneys who are willing to, play hard and be aggressive to really get this housing built.
Yeah, it speaks to really how there's like a giant ecosystem of solving this problem. Like the thing I think about a lot is the success of ADU law in California, where initially we passed good laws, and then a lot of localities found like loopholes or didn't want to enforce it. And the reason we found out about that is because we had good YIMBY activists and electeds locally who are like raising these issues. And then the legislature was able to do more fixes. But also, even after it was fixed, like places just tried to break the law. And like Attorney General Bonta was able to sue them and enforce the law. And so like what Elizabeth was talking about is like, it's not enough to just like have some folks pass good laws. Like you need an entire ecosystem of activists, attorney generals, leaders at every level who are fighting for housing to make sure nothing gets stuck at any part of the process, or, you know, you're playing a bit of whack-a-mole, but like everybody's got to be whacking the mole.
This is something that Attorney General Bonta brought up, right? He said, you know, look, I want to be all over this. I want to be tackling this everywhere it needs tackling. Obviously, I care deeply and I am constantly focused on this, but also I can't be everywhere. I don't have eyes and ears everywhere and a magic crystal ball. When we asked him what he needs from us, what he said was, look, we need people who are pro YIMBY and pro abundance and in this movement to be my eyes and ears and to tell me when cities aren't upholding their obligations and when cities are pulling stunts so that I can act on them. I can't sue them if I don't know about it. And Elizabeth, I think it's such a phenomenal point that is relevant to us, even as we think about where to prioritize and focus our efforts, that it's not just the legislators. You can, and we're seeing this at the federal level, right? You can pass laws, but there's also the matter of enforcing those laws. And you do need allies on both sides of that equation, because otherwise it doesn't become real. Armand, you mentioned local municipalities skirting a bit of the ADU laws. I'm going to go out on a limb and bet that you might have some stories of some of the maybe more funnier or comical shenanigans that some cities and municipalities have pulled to try to get out of their housing obligations.
Well, so recently, the city of Sausalito, the law says, according to Housing Accountability Act, that you have to abide by objective health and public safety standards to like disapprove housing if it meets all the rules. You can't just like arbitrarily say like, oh, I don't like it. And so they've now started requiring developers to submit data on a historic view impact, because they want to create software that will calculate the percentage of view that is impacted by a potential new housing unit of like historic or important views. This software doesn't currently exist. They're requiring like people to submit data for an algorithm that does not exist in hopes that it will one day exist, so that they can establish like how much this view affects you, or not seeing this percentage of a view affects you, and they can turn that into like law. That struck me a little silly. Or one in, you know, Rob Bonta talked about this, is like there's a city, Woodside, in California, that tried to declare the entire city a mountain lion preserve, so that therefore no housing could be built there. You know, it is not a city overrun with mountain lions. If it was actually a mountain lion preserve, people should move out of it. Like, they're very creative. They come up with a lot of strange justifications for not building housing.
I have a Texas story that could maybe make that. We attempted to pass a state level ADUs by right across the entire state of Texas. And one of the big NIMBY concerns was that these ADUs, you know, in people's backyards were going to be used for human trafficking, for keeping prostitutes in these ADUs, and that these would become little mini brothels in people's backyards.
Wow. I've not heard that one before. Oh my God.
Well, from brothels to under the sea, Armand, didn't Sausalito do something where like they were supposed to designate a certain amount of land for housing, and they were like, here's some eelgrass in the bay that you can use?
They did that too. One of the classic things for RHNA. So RHNA, regional housing needs assessment, good enunciation exercise, said that you have to cite like certain properties for building housing. And so what cities would like to do is cite places and say, we will, like, a bunch of housing will be built here. And they'll pick places like the middle of like abandoned woodlands or something, or like nobody has been for many, many years, or like a toxic waste dump. The best one is when they said that a bunch of housing will be built on the site of a police station, which the city itself owns. And so one of the YIMBYs emailed the head of like the police there and said, do you have plans to build housing on your police station? And they said, obviously not. And so then they forward this to the city. It's like, hey, your housing element says you're going to build housing there, but then your police chief says, no, we are not going to tear down our police station and turn it into housing.
All of these examples, they're extremely comical and they're so nonsensical as to feel very light and funny and almost bring a smile to your face until you remember the embarrassing and infuriating consequences, which manifests itself in a few ways. One is the devastating and immiserating effects it has on people when their rents get jacked up and people can't find a home or a roof over their head at all. It is, I think, a practice of laundering discrimination. We see it all out through zoning, but now it's laundering discrimination through bullshit and eelgrass, which is to say, hey, our city is closed to outsiders and we don't want your kind here. And then the national stakes are enormous, and we're going to bang this drum constantly. And Rob Bonta helped us bring it up, which is the 2030 census. Rob Bonta mentioned that California's housing goals as a state are aligned to 2030. And of course, we know that the 2030 census means that if blue states like California and New York don't build enough housing and welcome enough new residents and grow their population by 2030, their huge amount of population loss in this last decade and even in the last few years means that when the next census comes in 2030, the number of Congress people in each state and the number of, therefore, electoral votes in each state is going to get reassigned and recalculated. And so, for example, California in particular, the home of both our interviewees tonight, is set to lose 4 or 5 votes in Congress and 4 or 5 electoral votes in presidential elections, meaning that in the presidential election in 2032, 2036, and 2040, we could sweep the blue wall, win every state Joe Biden won to become president in 2020, and lose every single one of those elections without another shot till 2044 to whatever MAGA candidate is running, as well as losing the votes in Congress to be able to hold them back from breaking the law and doing away with our democracy altogether. And, for as much great work as Attorney General Bonta is doing to enforce state goals on building housing, I think those state goals to begin with are still not ambitious enough to meet this moment and turn back the tide. And a lot of that, I think, is because the word hasn't always gotten out that people don't know those are the stakes. And making sure that everyone knows this, that every California state representative and every voter in California knows that we have to build housing or lose America to MAGA fascism for a generation, and that every voter in California knows whether their representative is standing up to MAGA or enabling them, like a Trojan horse who speaks like a progressive and calls themselves a progressive and uses all the right words, but is ultimately doing the bidding of Donald Trump and the white supremacists and corrupt billionaires who fuel him. That's a pretty big part of our organizational mission. And this past week in California, at the sort of local and state level, there was some action here with a couple of really key votes, which featured both some exciting successes and some really disappointing missteps that feel sometimes like a betrayal and sometimes like people paying lip service to YIMBYism and then finding excuses not to make good on it in ways that ultimately don't rise to meet the stakes of the moment or even seem to take it into consideration. So, Armand, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what happened in California this past week.
Sure. So Senator Wiener, who's like the OG of California, like YIMBYism in the state legislature, introduced 2 bills, SB 79 and SB 677. SB 79 is like a big upzoning bill to build more housing near transit, with the argument being there are a lot of places in California that have the state has invested billions and billions of dollars to build really nice transit stations, and all the housing around it is either non-existent or single family. And so, frankly, the people who own those homes nearby got an enormous amount of value, but not a lot of people can easily use those transit stations that the state has poured a lot of resources into because there's not a lot of housing there. And from an environmental perspective, from a economic justice perspective, from a pro-transit perspective, building housing next to transit is easy winner. This would be probably the most ambitious in terms of raw units created housing bill that I've seen since really was called SB 827. It was Senator Wiener's first attempt in the legislature to write a really big upzoning. since then, we've had to done a lot of meaningful legislation, but like smaller bills. And this is sort of a return to form of going for a really big bill. Then there's SB 79, which is sort of a different category. Passed a few years ago, a bill called SB 9, which is meant to enable basically turning single family homes and lots in single family home areas into small apartments like duplexes, quadplexes. The legislation was written in such a way that was very, a lot of necessary political compromise that in practice, like we talked about the whack-a-mole, it hasn't actually resulted in that much housing built. And so the attempt this cycle was to do basically clean up. So for example, there's a provision in there about owner occupancy, with the vision being that we didn't want, there are folks who are concerned that people would come into these single family neighborhoods and buy up single family homes and turn them into speculate and turn them into apartments. And hearing me sound a little skeptical because I'm I don't think it's bad for people to build small apartments in those neighborhoods. That said, the idea was we wanted homeowners to build these themselves and require owner occupancy. In practice, very few homeowners have the resources or desire to become full-time developers and continue living in the property as they're building it out. And so the big change that was proposed was to say that we'll keep the owner occupancy requirement, but it can be the future occupant. And so, for example, if the developer, somebody who owns the properties collectively has to live in one of them, but it doesn't have to be the person who developed, which then opens the pipeline to actually having developers. There's a lot of other provisions, but that was sort of one of the big controversies. And so what actually happened at the state legislature is there was a discussion in the Senate Housing Committee. It's chaired by Senator Aisha Wahab from Fremont, Hayward area. And it was a very big political fight. And there's a lot of testimony. And the way these things work is if it dies in that committee, it is very unlikely. It is possible, but it's very unlikely that it continues in this legislative session. And so it's a really big test. Every bill that you see sort of voted on in the legislature has to go through committees and survive all these committees. And if it dies in any one of them, it's pretty much dead. And it's actually kind of funny to see how the sausage is made, because even on the day of when it's happening, people have not fully decided. And so for a long time, it was this strange thing where they're going through other bills, they're getting testimony, people line up. So give support and oppose it and get public comment. But they didn't have a quorum. And Senator Wiener was literally not even there. And if I didn't know and I was just watching this as a naive person, I'd be I don't get it. Is he late or something? But what's actually happening, I don't have any inside word on this. I just generally know is that people are trying to negotiate furiously behind the scenes, and there's back and forth and conversation and all that stuff. But ultimately, by a hair, SB 79 passed to live another day, and SB 677 died by a single vote, which is really disappointing because I think there's an enormous amount of housing that we can unlock for creating modest apartments and single family neighborhoods to create more of what we call streetcar suburbs. But allowing 79 to pass still was a huge achievement. And it's very interesting to see sort of the arguments there. There's sort of left-wing arguments against housing, which were sort of the argument that it can cause displacement, build market rate housing, that we need to build more affordable, not market rate housing. And then there's more right-wing arguments that were there's a Senator Sayarto from, I believe, Temecula, who's, I want to be polite, but he was arguing that the reason people are moving out of California is because we're building too many apartments. And people are so upset about the apartments being built that they are then moving to Texas, which I think Elizabeth would find amusing because Texas is building a lot of housing.
Right. It's not a coincidence that we are going to gain electoral votes and congressional seats. So
I would say that the overall takeaway on this is just I was very happy to see these things advance, but it's also kind of strange. I've been doing this for over 10 years, and these were the same arguments other senators and other people who fulfilled these roles were saying. It was a time capsule. It's very strange. Even in like the YIMBY world of the people argue with us online or in the discourse or in journals or so on, like the arguments have evolved a lot. But here it was just like time had not passed in the legislature. And I think it's a good lesson to like touch grass. A lot of us, I think, especially people who don't like YIMBYs, are often like, they'll tell me that they feel like we're so dominant. Like even today, I was talking to a friend who's like, I'm not going to name them, but they were saying they kind of are in the more tenant advocacy space. And they casually mentioned, they're like, YIMBYs are so powerful in Sacramento. And I was like, I didn't feel very powerful watching this testimony. I'll be frank. Like when someone's going on for a long time of how important it is to mandate parking in apartments and we barely survived this vote, it feels like we're still a long way to go when shit hits the real fan.
Yeah, I feel like we're ascendant. We have momentum, but there is a long road and a big uphill battle to go.
I was going to say, compare this to what just happened in Montana, right? Red state that might also end up gaining an electoral vote. And, just this week, it was announced that, like, on top of their big YIMBY bill that passed in 2023, they just legalized 6-story buildings on every major commercial land, limited impact fees, which are huge in California, reduced liability, professionalized historical reviews, and then also legalized ADUs in rural places without all these limitations, and a single scale residential buildings throughout the state. It was like a huge sweep of another YIMBY bills. And so when we talk about how difficult it is to pass these bills, whether in Massachusetts or California or all these other places, it's also sad because it's not hard everywhere in the country. In so many ways, red states are lapping us. And it just really reinforces how possible all of this is. And it's really, in some ways, Democrats getting in our own way.
It's kind of fascinating, just the partisan dynamics where it's like in California, if you look at polling, the most YIMBY people are Democrats. Like consistently, all the big housing bills are opposed by like from actual voters, more conservative voters. But then like actual red states like Texas and Montana pass like way more YIMBY law. It's like Republicans in different states act differently, which I haven't quite gotten a beat on.
Yeah, and the Trump administration, they're no YIMBYs. I mean, they're extreme NIMBYs. They oppose construction. Obviously, they're making it radically more expensive with tariffs on on everything that's needed for construction. They are all about protecting the suburbs from these intruders. Trump to me is a kind of ultimate NIMBY, somebody whose whole animating purpose, even outside of the issue of housing, is about saying, well, I come from a privileged class and frankly, a privileged country. And what I want to do is I want to lock in and consolidate and preserve that privilege forever at the expense of continuing to build and continuing to create and continuing to develop. He's trying to freeze the country in time in ways that if you think about trade, you try to build walls around other countries to maintain your status. And what's going to happen very quickly is your status is going to evaporate and your competitive edge and your advantages will disappear because you're not pushing forward with new creations and new solutions that build on what you've created before. This vote in California, to me, is very emblematic of the great progress we've made and the huge struggle we are in the midst of. You mentioned State Senator Aisha Wahab. I'm in San Jose today. Her district extends into part of San Jose. I could walk there. So at the top of this meeting, she said she knows, quote, there's a supply issue. She says we must build housing at all income levels. But then she decided that the bill was a non-starter for her because of massive giveaways to developers. And it just makes me think of a few things. One is, I saw somebody on they post on Twitter, it's just a silly little meme, but it was like, Democrats will feed 100 people in fear that one of them might starve, whereas Republicans will starve 100 people in fear that one of them might deserve food. And it is certainly clear that Republicans are starving a lot of people and will continue to make massive cuts, both in the United States and around the world, that immiserate people and send people to their deaths. And also very in a focused way are targeting people they don't like. Although actually they're not just picking on vulnerable people they don't like the trans community, they're picking on their own voters all the time and crushing manufacturing workers and crushing states that have natural disasters and need aids and say, hey, you guys are on your own. But I looked at this little quote, this little meme, and I thought, man, is that still true? Like, I want this to be true. But just as it's bad when Republicans punish everyone so they can hurt the people they don't like, I think it's also bad when what I would call like a faux-gressive immiserates everyone just so that we can make sure developers don't profit, right? It's like, we could do this good thing, but what if a couple people make money? Therefore, we should not do this good thing. And then everybody loses. And this culture where everybody loses is deeply hurting people and also deeply hurting the country. State Senator Aisha Wahab, also defending this dual approach, said, I try to be as holistic as possible. And I don't think there's a holistic way to cede and surrender the country to the MAGA movement for 20 years. So, you're starting to say the right words, and that's a really good step. That's important. But it's got to translate into law. And it's also got to translate into a mindset, one that says it's not about picking people who need to lose. It's about making sure we all can win. And, if somebody does make money, great, tax them and spread that around. But man, we need to have a culture where everybody's getting upgrades, not one where we are so intent to make sure some people don't get a boost that everybody gets kicked down a few rungs. I think it's painful and sad for the state.
I'll also say that in many ways, I think that people talk about dark abundance or that the lack of abundance is about scarcity. Like, I went to the National League of Cities where J.D. Vance spoke to the crowd of people from cities all over the country. And he gave a little bit of kudos to Austin for housing and was like, there's a supply demand issue. You should build a little bit more supply. But then quickly turned around. But the far more impactful thing is to cut demand by like pushing out millions of immigrants. And so I think that's a dark alternative, right? Is that if you don't expand supply, if you don't talk about building more housing, people will still notice the high housing prices and they'll see that you are not willing to do that. And it'll turn to the darker alternative of just making it a more closed community and trying to kick people out.
It reminded me of like very early on in like my SF housing activism. I ended up like somehow in this meeting and I was just some like nobody, but they were like much more important people. Like there was this man who used to run a lot of the like affordable housing groups in the city who primarily spent his time opposing market rate housing. And he specifically said that like what was important to him was controlling the demographic mix of San Francisco and making sure that like the right people were in the city. And from his perspective, it was like a left-wing version of it, of like not tech bros and like not yuppies, but just like, and there were used to be also writing, there's a man named Tim Redman in 48 Hills, and they've learned now not to publicly make these arguments, but they would explicitly argue for an American version of what's called hukou in China, which is that like you can't just move to a city, you have to get like a permit to live in that city. I think when you don't have an approach for building more housing, you see sort of, Malthusianism is this old idea of like, there are only so many resources, we're going to run out. So we need to like keep the population down. And the right-wing version of it is like J.D. Vance's of like, get the immigrants out. The left-wing version of it is like, restrict who can go into a city or live in the city, make sure like the tech bros or whatever group we don't like can't. But those are both, like you said, I think like sort of the dark alternatives to a vision of abundance, which is like cities are for everybody.
Living in San Francisco, this is one of the things that has driven me bonkers and makes it hard to live up to our values and hard to share that our values are authentic when you have people who are the same people who are showing up to protest Trump wanting to build a wall are using explicitly the exact same language sometimes to say we need to build a wall around San Francisco to keep out the wrong kinds of people.
I think the mayor of Cupertino literally said that about Cupertino a couple years back.
And, we are seeing the stakes here at the national level, right? Burhan is a great segue to something Congressman Robert Garcia, our next interviewee, did recently. You mentioned J.D. Vance's solution to the housing crisis is deportations, right? If we're trying so hard to move the Democratic Party from a zero-sum mindset to a positive-sum mindset. Look, J.D. Vance and the Trump administration have a negative-sum mindset, right? Everybody loses as long as these people I don't like lose more. And so one of the things that Robert Garcia did after our interview with him was to hop down to El Salvador to work to negotiate, both to investigate the conditions of and work to negotiate the release of Kilmar Albrego Garcia, who was deported against objections by the court with no due process and chucked away in a Salvadoran concentration camp called Sikot. Congressman Garcia noted that he demanded to go to Sikot, and they've so far the government of El Salvador lets Republicans visit, but they have staunchly refused to let Democrats visit and even see what's going on there. This prison camp shrouded in mystery that we are sending undesirables to without trial. And again, it's just horrifying because for reasons that are completely regardless of these people that are being deported. Because if you don't have a trial where you prove that someone's here illegally, if you don't have a trial where you prove that somebody has gang ties, then all of us do, right? Then it only takes JD Vance saying, "Hey, those Radio Abundance hosts, I hear they're MS-13," and you're out, right? If you don't get if one person doesn't get a trial, maybe nobody gets a trial, and that could come for anybody. So it's horrifying stuff, and I think Robert Garcia is somebody who has he's been an aggressive YIMBY advocate and launching the YIMBY Caucus. He has deep California ties, not only as a representative, but as the former mayor of Long Beach. And in Congress, he's working both to advance those goals and boost the Democratic Party, but also to take on Trump's lawlessness. We're really thankful for our work. And here is our interview with Congressman Robert Garcia.
We have a Supreme Court that's voted 9-0 to ensure that Kilmer is sent back to the United States. The Trump administration has been clear that they have no intention of doing that. They've also knowingly admitted they sent him there on accident, and now that is being defied, which is incredibly serious for due process in this country. Well, we took a group of House Democrats, we asked for an official codel from House Republicans. On the House side, you have to get permission from the majority. They refused to do so to grant a congressional delegation, and so we just had to go ourselves. It's important for us to continue to go. What Senator Van Hollen did is absolutely the right thing. We won't also be the last group. There'll be more House Democrats that will go. We met with the U.S. Embassy there and the ambassador on the ground, had a classified briefing, got a lot of important information. We made continued demands for Kilmer's release. We also asked about other folks that are there wrongly in prison, like Andrea Romero, who's an LGBTQ asylum seeker, and others. We also met with and talked with Kilmer's family that the work isn't done until it's Kilmer back home and Donald Trump follows the Supreme Court. The number one issue that folks in my office back home are calling me about is this one. And in the last 2 weeks, we have heard more about this case, the attack on democracy that applies to the Supreme Court, than any other issue that's come into our office. It's incredibly important. Kilmer and others have been wrongly imprisoned illegally in El Salvador. This is a due process issue in the United States. In the United States of America, everyone has a right to due process, whether you're a citizen or you're a non-citizen, whether you are in a student visa, you still have that right. And that is being stripped away from people right now because of the Trump administration. Everyone in our country deserves a right to a lawyer, to a fair trial in court. And our laws are clear. Whether you're a citizen, whether you're an immigrant, whether you're here on a student visa, whether you're protesting something that you believe in, you have a right to a judicial process that is fair. That is now being denied to people in this country. I think all Americans should be concerned about that.
That was the star of tonight's next interview, Congressman Robert Garcia, the first ever openly LGBTQ immigrant to ever serve in Congress. Congressman Garcia is also the founder of the first ever bipartisan Congressional YIMBY Caucus. We had a little something to do with that, as it turns out. We got the chance to sit down with Congressman Garcia before his trip to El Salvador. To get us started, here's Steve Boyle.
Congressman Robert Garcia, thanks so much for joining us on Radio Abundance, and thanks so much for your collaboration this past fall. You were a big supporter of YIMBYs for Harris, and it was exciting just how that lined up with the launch of the YIMBY Caucus, the first ever bipartisan Congressional YIMBY Caucus, which you led the founding of. We got a chance to chat and sit down for a little bit of an interview ahead of some phone banking. I believe you broke some news about when the caucus and its members were going to be announced, which held up. It was indeed mid-November, and it's been exciting to see who you've brought on board. We've already spoken with Congressman Jake Auchincloss and are a fan of him, and we're just super excited to be chatting with you today.
Yeah, same here. And we're actually having kind of a first YIMBY Caucus roundtable launch event happening here in just a couple of weeks out here in DC.
Oh, awesome.
With folks from DC, which is interesting. We've got a couple bills that we're working on. So I'm excited about the YIMBY Caucus. I mean, obviously, there's a lot going on right now that has people's attention. So, we want to continue to move forward and have those discussions in light of kind of the, 5-alarm fire that's happening across the government right now. And so, both are important.
Yeah. I want to ask, I think we all want to ask for a little bit of the blow by blow for the YIMBY caucus, the whole origin story, what you've done so far, and what we can expect, both as you ramp up in the coming weeks, but also the ambitions legislatively. As we get to that, though, I also want to ask, because you brought up the 5-alarm fire, there's a lot going on right now. There is absolute chaos and free fall from the Trump administration. There is, and then also in our circles, a lot of excitement around Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's new book on abundance. There's a lot of threads here to connect together, and I'm just curious, before we get to the details, what you see as the intersection points between those conversations. What does abundance and countering fascism, how do they collide?
Yeah, it's it is an interesting moment. I think obviously the kind of debate and discussion around abundance has actually been really interesting and I think very positive. I think it has to be viewed as kind of an incredible vehicle to have this conversation about progress that doesn't also live in its own silo. I think there's other things happening when paired with what is being said and kind of what the meat of abundance is about is actually pretty exciting. Look, I think the YIMBY caucus is and has always been about focusing on ways that we can address the housing crisis in this country, that we can say yes to more housing, that we can say yes to good multimodal transit, that we can say yes to understanding the relationship between climate and housing. And we wanted to get folks together, of course, in Congress that on both sides of the aisle and had a kind of a grounding in this work and maybe didn't know they were YIMBY folks, but knew that the movement was growing across the country. And that's kind of why we formed the caucus. And it's bipartisan. We brought different folks to the table. Obviously, we had a big election. We've been discussing the kind of the ramifications and impacts of that election, particularly on housing. And since Trump's been in office, we have been completely focused on the attacks at HUD, the attacks on transit projects across the country, the attacks on the Inflation Reduction Act and its climate provisions, and all those impacts to the things that we all care about, and particularly around the progress that we want to ensure that every person in this country has access to a good neighborhood and a good home. What's been interesting in the last few weeks, particularly since abundance has come out and the conversations we've seen kind of everywhere, is there's a lot of energy, obviously, around this idea that we can have a future where that is pro-immigrant, pro-progress, pro-development, pro-housing, that is more utopian than the one that we're in now, where everyone actually can live in a community or in a city or a neighborhood where they have access to the things that they need. And a vision of a government and a country where we are inviting difference, but that all of us have access to the things that we need. So you match that, I think, with what's happening with this kind of coalition of working people, working class people, people that are feeling fed up with the system, people that are seeing their Medicaid being attacked, Social Security being attacked, programs they care about being attacked, and the anger that you have on the ground, I think is a really interesting moment and an opportunity for all of us in the movement. And so I think it's interesting. I think what's happening as it relates to this kind of anti kind of conversation about anti kind of billionaires that are hoarding all of this wealth for themselves and not sharing it with the middle class or the working class, I think is interesting. So I think all of that is kind of where we're at. And I think that YIMBYs, I think that people that believe in progress, I think is there's an interesting space for us. I've always believed that most YIMBY folks I know are not just for progress and for housing and for sustainability, but they're also pretty progressive people on social issues. We're people that are very supportive of gay rights. We believe women should have access to their own health care. We think that we should be focused on the bigger issues that bring us together. We're we understand what migration has done for our country. And so there's a space there where we also understand you can be overregulated, that government can sometimes get in the way of housing and of building and of progress. And so I think all of that intersection is kind of where we're at right now.
You know, you bring up something that is very top of mind for us, which is where does abundance meet the fight oligarchy movement? And seeing those two movements that each have a lot of energy themselves, not as competitors for alternative visions of the Democratic Party, but as extremely complementary and kind of two twin pieces of the solution and of how we confront incumbent privilege. And you talked a lot about coalition building in a couple of different ways, both in how we reach out to working folks, and then in your own formation of the YIMBY Caucus. You know, you mentioned a second ago bringing in folks that maybe weren't YIMBYs, and so indoctrinating them and awakening them that they are now full-blown members of the caucus and working with you on this great work. So I wonder if you can reflect on that and tell us how you what lessons we can learn as we take this message to recruit more folks to the movement, and maybe just for the sake of time, pivot from there to telling us what's on the roadmap for the YIMBY Caucus.
Yes, I mean, look, I think first the kind of fighting, kind of the billionaire class, the oligarchy, kind of establishment that's in this country, I think is a lot of energy right now. I think that people are feeling really angry, which I think is important for us to recognize. I mean, I think I think abundance is an optimistic kind of perspective. It's very much about a future. It's very much about what liberals would love to see as kind of this incredible space where we could all live kind of in harmony, and if we all had access to things that we need and want, particularly a roof and housing over our heads. And I think that there is a lot of that hope within, I think, what Bernie and AOC are doing. The truth is that we talk to someone like Alexandria, or to like AOC, she very much is a pro-housing person. And I think that in the past, I think kind of pro-housing folks have unnecessarily gotten in the way of each other and kind of fought each other, because there's different priorities within the housing space. And I think oftentimes the YIMBY movement has been slow to recognize the importance of diversity and diverse voices within the YIMBY space. And I think oftentimes kind of housing grassroots activism has been slow to acknowledge that over-regulation actually is a burden to building more housing. I think we're in a different moment right now, where I think we're with these different kind of parts of the coalition can see each other more clearly. And we have to recognize that housing is the single largest challenge in this country, separate of the destruction of our government. Housing will remain, it is today, it will remain after this nightmare with Elon Musk and Donald Trump. It will remain the single largest issue we have. And it's quite sad, right? Because Elon Musk in like another alternate like universe would have been a really interesting, powerful force in this country, and was on his way to possibly building a really strong following. You think about Tesla, you think about what he's done with SpaceX, and then he just let it crash and burn, and he became, in my opinion, just someone that's a psychopath, someone that had no empathy. He turned away from the values that we believe a better world should be, which is embracing difference. So I think that's one of the big issues.
We'd love to hear, sort of touching on what Stephen said, what if you could give us a little preview of sort of the legislation the YIMBY Caucus is working on, and also how you see, I know DC, you guys vote on like debt bills and continuing resolutions, like where you see that legislatively happening. Like, do you think some of those things could be attached to a larger bill, or is it something that you pass as standalone? We'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple initial things we're going to do. First, we're YIMBY, and now that we're having we've been having a lot of organizing kind of staff meetings behind the scenes. We're having our first kind of public roundtable, like I mentioned to you, where we're bringing in some kind of YIMBY experts to talk to staff and to members, and to really start a broader conversation about kind of long-term planning. We're going to start. So one piece of this is essentially like kind of getting a database together and collecting all kind of the YIMBY bills that are in Congress. And so what does a YIMBY bill look like? What could get that kind of YIMBY stamp of approval? And we've built kind of a good national network now of a lot of the groups that we're working with and talking with directly. And so that's kind of phase one. Is we want to build the YIMBY Caucus so there's kind of long-term investment and interest. It's not just like a one-year thing. And so we need to do a good job of first making sure that we set standards for bills that are important to the caucus. That's what we're doing right now. The second piece of it is then uplifting bills that we believe are YIMBY bills. And so some of those are going to start getting to be introduced. We're reintroducing the People Over Parking Act, for example, it comes in the next few weeks. There's other bills, other transit-related bills. We have a big bill with Elizabeth Warren that we introduced last Congress, which is electrification of kind of transit and resources. That's another bill that's going to be a YIMBY bill. Working with kind of the Green New Deal folks, of which I'm a member of as well, and seeing where there's overlap. Then doing some interesting new kind of projects. I mean, look, I've mentioned this before, so it's not like a big secret, but even in our own backyard here in Washington, D.C., you're probably familiar that there's a lot of restrictions on look at what's happened to the local zoning as it relates to the Hyde Act and what you actually can build in D.C. I think there's a lot of interest in having conversations about about the restrictions we even put even here in Washington, right? And so I think the caucus is interested in all of those pieces, and then at the same time protecting and trying to work in a bipartisan way, which is hard in this moment, in the departments and agencies that are actually moving our initiatives forward. So HUD, I mean, it makes no sense to roll back grants and roll back vouchers for people that are looking for homes. Like, why are we doing this in a housing crisis? It makes no sense to limit grants and to essentially change the way grants are provided and take out sustainability provisions in grant. We're concerned that DOT is going to roll back and remove any progress that we've made in linking grants to housing. So these are issues that I think are really real, but issues that the YIMBY Caucus can be very much involved in. Then the last piece, and this is going to be as we grow, is kind of more like a future vision that I have, is I want to it'd be great to be able to create relationships where we can actually really monitor state policy and how we get involved in state policy. Like, I feel like we, for example, made a big difference, for example, in Arizona last year by bringing attention to the Department of Defense, who was out there opposing housing projects and encouraging the governor to oppose housing projects and zoning reform that cities were trying to adopt. And nobody would have ever known that. So, we dug in, we found the Department of Defense was doing this, we called it out, we brought attention to it, a lot of press in Arizona about this issue, and we brought important attention to that. And so right now there are agencies in the government that are stopping housing, federal government. So the YIMBY Caucus needs to be the vehicle to address federal government intervention into building more housing.
And then, I think kind of zooming out, I think in terms of how YIMBY connects with overall the Democratic election strategy, can you share more about how YIMBY is important for 2028 and the census redrawing in 2030?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's safe to say that the YIMBY movement, as I know it at least, it's an interesting movement, right? I mean, it's generally progressive, but there's also a lot of more. There's also some conservative voices within the YIMBY space that are very much kind of focused on the kind of libertarian perspective as it relates to zoning and regulation and all of those things that impact construction and so forth. That I understand that piece, but I think that if you're not willing to connect housing to climate, to kind of social justice issues, to me, those are all important pieces of the YIMBY movement. And the YIMBY movement, at the end of the day, believes that all human beings have the dignity and the humanity to be able to have a place to live, to sleep at night, to live in a good community and neighborhood, and to have support from your neighbors around you. And that the YIMBY is all about let's build more homes, and let's build more homes everywhere that we can. And so I find it to be a pretty progressive movement. I think that young Democrats, especially what's interesting is young Democrats that in some ways are leaving the party or that are confused about where they are. I think YIMBY can be a vehicle to bring particularly some of those young men that are oftentimes kind concerned or worried about where they're going to go. And where the YIMBY movement can be very powerful is in the price and the cost of housing. When you ask people, and particularly young people, what the concerns are with the Democratic Party or politics, they're going to tell you, look, the costs are too high. People are telling us the costs have been too high for a long time, and no one's addressing that. And when you ask people where they're being hurt the most, yes, broadly, there's a lot of answers, but yes, young people, it's the cost of housing, the cost of rent, where they're basically paycheck to paycheck trying to pay their rent, or it's the idea that they're never going to be able to buy their own home. And that kind of desperation of not being able to attain what your parents maybe were able to do, or other folks that that were able to buy a home, is discouraging. And so as a political movement, I think YIMBY has an opportunity to address the single largest desire of young people, which is to change their condition as it relates to their affordability of housing. So that's, I think, one thing can do a lot.
One thing I'd love to just see the idea with you, it's a thing I've heard from a lot of folks in sort of the ADU industry and building of small homes industry, is that currently the tax code treats selling. So if you build an apartment and sell it to investors for rental purposes, you're taxed at long-term capital gains. But if you sell it to individual homeowners for sale, which is, I think, for a lot of young people, the next step after renting, they want to buy a home, and often the only option is like single family home, rather than all the for sale home ownership and condos being built. I'm curious if that's something that you guys have looked at, or just even if you haven't. I want you to know that that's a thing, so you get
it is a thing.
What people think about it. Yeah,
I'm very aware of that as a thing. I mean, look, there's so many barriers. I mean, that's why right now in any growing city in California, for the most part, all the units that are being added to stock is all for lease. It's all this for lease, right? I mean, and that is because they can't make that bottom line. I mean, we have to create a system where, for those that are actually building the housing, that they're actually able to make their investment back if they're able to put those units on the market. And right now, it's just not financially feasible for most of these folks to do for sale product, or it will be decades until they can do for sale product. And so that's really important as it relates to building density, and a variety of other reforms. And that one is one, maybe at the top of the list. But also, it's just funny. I was just reading an article about a project in Long Beach that, when I was mayor, we changed zoning on to create micro units, and the units are tiny. And I was reading some comments on social media, and everyone's complaining, who the hell would want to live in a 350 square foot unit? This is insane. There's no parking. And I'm sitting there going, this is awesome. Yes, it took a parking lot. Who cares? Look at all these people we're going to house. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of people that would be willing to take a 350 square foot, 400 square foot unit, when the old minimum in Long Beach used to be 600. And this, this is changing that, the ability for people to have more access, just put more homes there. And so changing some of those kind of national standards, encouraging some different standards in size of the unit, in kind of shared and mixed shared spaces. I'm a big supporter of shared space in residential units. I love new concepts where people are sharing kitchen spaces, people are sharing restaurant spaces. And this is not about degrading your quality of life. This is about giving people options about how they want and choose to live, which I think is critical. I think the kind of single stair conversation happening right now, California, super important. So those are all, I think, different opportunities for us back home in my home state, but also across the country.
Congressman, we talked a little bit about the politics of the moment. Your time is divided between pushing YIMBY bills and building that coalition, and trying to put out the fires of the Trump administration. So I'm curious how you think of bipartisanship in this moment. The YIMBY Caucus is proudly bipartisan. The YIMBY movement has been proudly bipartisan. There's a lot of areas of common ground. And also the folks you're working with are at the same time empowering detentions and crashing the economy. So I'm curious how you think about when to work with and how to both work with and oppose those folks. And then on that note, send us out on this, which is, I think a lot of folks are listening to this and thinking, hey, how can I help make the YIMBY Caucus a success? But also, how can I, as an ordinary person out there, stand up to Trump right now? So I am curious what you think or ordinary folks listening to this can be doing right now to avert disaster and build the world we want to see?
Well, I mean, first, I'm never going to work with anyone that is trying to harm people's rights or harm the ability for women to have full access to their body autonomy, or trash gay people or trans people, or that want to degrade immigrants. Like those folks, and there are some horrific ones in the Republican Party. I mean, from as far as I'm concerned, should leave Congress, because we don't want those people running our country. And I think that on the big fights, we're going to fight them every time. If there are opportunities for us to work together in these different caucus spaces to move policies that we agree forward that aren't harming the rights of people, then I'm all ears. But I'm never going to work with a Republican in a bipartisan way on anything to do with taking away someone's rights or harming someone's personal liberty. But if a Republican wants to come to the table and help me and help us change the way kind of the regulatory framework is to get more money into housing, let's talk about that. I mean, I think that is something that is always still possible. Is it harder to do in this moment? Absolutely. I mean, Elon Musk and Donald Trump have made it immensely more difficult to get anything done. We're right now just trying to plug as many holes as possible on this ship is really where we're at. As far as folks that are trying to oppose Elon Musk and Donald Trump, I mean, I've been very vocal. I think Donald Trump's the worst thing that happened to this country in the last 100 years. He is a horrific president. He's destroying our institutions and the foundations of our agencies that we need to actually build a better country and to strive for a country where everyone has access to housing. And so I think as far as opposition, people should continue to be loud, to be vocal, to match the Republican energy. Republicans are great, in my opinion, at lying, manipulating, cheating, doing whatever it takes to win. And I think Democrats are figuring out that we've got to be a lot tougher and we've got to be a lot louder. And that folks like AOC has a message that resonates with the average person. And I get tired of people saying, oh, well, she represents one wing of the party. She's speaking for a lot of folks. She's out there, bringing people together. And so I think that that's a way for us to win, is to push back, to continue to call folks, flip the House in a couple of years, and hopefully we can get more of our policy agenda done.
Congressman Garcia, thank you so much for joining us today on Radio Abundance. Thanks for all the support this past fall as we mobilized against the Trump administration. And thanks for your work with the YIMBY Caucus. We are excited to see what you build.
Yeah, for sure. It's going to be exciting when we to look back and think of all the good work we're going to do here. So look forward to working with you guys.
All right. That was Congressman Robert Garcia. Let's start with Burhan. Burhan, what'd you think?
I thought it was great. He really highlighted how progressive members in the Democratic Party, at least at the national level, have always been pro-housing. I remember years back when the YIMBY movement was a lot newer, how AOC had in her policy platform ending exclusionary zoning. And I thought that was awesome because locally the fight ends up being so coded over, how progressive are you? And maybe, progressives shouldn't support pro-housing measures. But national Democrats from AOC to more locally, Elizabeth Warren, have always supported pro-housing measures. And it's really exciting to see all the progress that, the YIMBY Caucus in Congress, but also how every national Democrat kind of sees the light on how important it is to build housing.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a few quotes here from some progressive leaders and vanguards of the left. AOC has a quote where she says, "For decades, thanks to restrictive zoning laws, we simply haven't built enough housing." Elizabeth Warren joined us at YIMBYs for Harris and told us that housing is at the heart of American life, and our problem is basic Econ 101. We don't have enough housing, and that drives up costs and makes housing unaffordable. The answer, pretty straightforward: build more housing. Gen Z Congressman and YIMBY Caucus member Maxwell Frost, who joined Bernie and AOC at their recent rally in Southern California to play the drums, and also joined us on YIMBYs for Harris, has said we need to get rid of things like exclusionary zoning laws and parking minimums, which keep us from being able to build affordable housing and high density housing. And Bernie Sanders said restrictive zoning ordinances are a racist legacy of Jim Crow era efforts to enforce segregation. We should make federal housing and transportation funds contingent on remedying these zoning ordinances. Elizabeth Warren introduced a great bill to spur the construction of housing across America and make federal grants contingent on local cities and states improving and relaxing their zoning. So the idea that this is some left center battle is nonsense. Housing is for everybody. The ability to build housing, making it cheaper to build housing and making it legal to build housing is important both for the market, but also for the government to build public housing, subsidized housing, and affordable housing. And the goals here are complementary, and the strategies need to be complementary as well, because we simply cannot fight over an increasingly scarce pie. In abundance, Ezra Klein says the economy is not a pie, and his point is that it's not just about growing the pie; it's that you don't just get more of the same, berries. You get different things and different foods and different inventions and different ideas and that sort of cornucopia of items. So I think of it less now as growing the pie than throwing a feast. But these ideas, everything that the progressive movement, which we are a part of, cares about, from social justice to economic justice to lifting up the least among us, depends on housing. And a lot of the vanguard of the progressive left knows this and believes this. Armand, I know you're a multiple-time Bernie voter, I believe, and a fan, and I wonder how you see the synthesis of these ideas.
Well, one, I just wanted to say I think it's really funny that, and I caught myself doing this now. It's like Ezra Klein and Derek's abundance are like religious texts. Like, as Ezra said in passage 3, like I find myself quoting it like every other day. I'm like, oh my God, I'm such a simp.
I
So
actually said this during the Abundance Network meeting too. We were just talking as like elected officials from different places. And I was like, since we're quoting Ezra like Jesus.
He's YIMBY Jesus. He has the beard now.
As does Pete Buttigieg, looking pretty handsome and tanned and beardy. JD Vance is not going to have much in the way of positive legacies. Maybe he'll kill Putin like he killed the Pope. But I think his one positive contribution to American life may be bringing beards back for national politicians. So we'll see. We'll see if JD Vance and Pete Buttigieg are a new millennial trend of bearded politicians.
I've
Back to
heard
you, Armand.
anyway on the grapevine, in the rumor world, that Buttigieg is very much like abundance pilled, but he's not yet publicly like come out.
Well, he talked about it a little bit on the recent podcast with Andrew Schultz. He didn't, I don't think, said the word abundance, but as they were discussing trains, talked about how Democrats get in our own way, how government gets in our own way. Actually, he was specifically, this is very interesting, he was responding to, I think Andrew Schultz and his fellow co-hosts talked about corruption and big money being poured into initiatives and then not seeing the results, and isn't that corruption? And Pete Buttigieg said, look, it's very reasonable to look at that and assume that. In some ways, the answer, I'm not saying it's worse, but like it's actually not corruption and people pilfering the money. It's the process being ground to such inertia and such a halt that we don't make good on that spending or spend it efficiently. Like in some ways, it would be easier if there was an evil overlord taking money away. It's actually just us grinding up the gears so we don't get any return on our national investment. And that frustrates people and that drives them in this fascist direction. And I think he explained really well why alleviating that was key to both progressive goals and just like core American goals and American values for how we take care of each other.
When I really appreciated like thinking about like the interview with Congressman Garcia, like very, very, very honed in on pushing the argument, which is true, which is that like abundance is about achieving progressive goals, right? Like building public transit is a progressive value. And it drives me crazy that the people who are very obsessed with how to make it easier and faster to build public transit get coded as like neoliberal centrists. Like the people who are just like, we should fund it, get to be like left wing, but then the people who are like, we should fund it and figure out how to actually get it built, they're like, you sell out, you don't care about progressive values. It's like completely topsy-turvy. And like that's why, I volunteered for Bernie twice. I donated twice. I was heartbroken when he lost. And it has been really heartbreaking for me to see that a lot of the folks who have been aligned with him or considering themselves as like inheritors of his legacy have sometimes been very like critical of abundance, because the reason I got into abundance and cared about abundance because the really big things I want our society to accomplish, like build lots and lots of affordable housing, build unlimited clean energy. Like those are progressive goals, right? Like we want to do that. And sometimes people will tell me like Republicans like will be like, well, like, why don't you just join us? Like we want to make it easier to build and so on. But it's like, you guys don't want to make it, it's not priority for you to solve climate change. It's not priority for you to get people out of cars and provide them public transit. Like it is for us. So we need to get out of our way of stopping us from accomplishing the goals that we have. And so it's an uphill battle, been an uphill battle for a long time, and I'll keep fighting it. And I'm really glad to see Congressman Garcia like in the center of the fight.
Yeah, I want to bring Elizabeth and Burhan in a second, but it just makes me think about the great rallies that AOC and Bernie have been doing together, and the great, amazing message that AOC in particular has been putting out there. And those rallies are especially focusing on the idea of fighting oligarchy. And I've said it before that I think the combination of abundance and fighting oligarchy, their synthesis point is the future of the Democratic Party and part of our revival and part of our message of both reform and optimism and creation and unleashing every citizen from the constraints that shackle them. But I don't even think it takes much in the way of creative synthesis. I think it's the same thing. And what I mean by that is, I think of fight oligarchy as saying, hey, just because you're a billionaire and you have made it in the global economy doesn't mean that you get to pull the ladder up on everybody else, doesn't mean that you get to rewrite the rules of government, to eliminate any competition to you, to lock in and consolidate all of your privileges, to try and stop them from ever changing, and to insulate yourself from anybody else who deserves their piece of this. And to me, abundance is saying that, but instead of about a billionaire, it's about millionaires. It's about saying, hey, you won in your city. You won in the game of home ownership. Congratulations. And that's exciting. But just because you won doesn't mean that you get to pull up the ladder from out from under everybody else. Doesn't mean that you get to rewrite the rules of government to consolidate your privilege. It's less than a billionaire, but there's also more of you. It doesn't mean that you get to lock everybody else out of that dream as well and stop the world from changing. So I see abundance and fight oligarchy both as being about confronting not just privilege and a consolidation of a privilege, but the kind of freezing the world in amber, stop the world from turning. I like it the way it is now, and I refuse to participate in continuing to lift other people up and continuing to compete myself. I see it as part of the same movement. And I think making those connections is extremely vital. And I'm curious, Elizabeth, what you think about that.
Yeah, I think, one thing that we need to be able to do, though, is to be able to really communicate abundance in a way that reaches people that aren't already plugged into politics. And so, you talk to the average person that's, working hard to provide for their family, raising kids. I'm not sure the idea of abundance always immediately is evident. And so that's why we need to find ways of talking to people about what this could mean in their actual life. And what that can mean is that not only will you be able to afford a home, but that someday when you have children and they go on to have their own children, that they will be able to afford a home as well. That, your grandchildren will be able to afford to live in the same city that you live in.
Yeah.
And that's, something when I've met with legislators in the Texas legislature about this, I've talked to them about this exact concept that, if we freeze things in time, there could come a day when your grandchildren have to move to, your children may have to take your grandchildren to another state that's more affordable, to a state that has figured out its housing crisis. And so even when you win, do you really win if your family and your descendants can't afford to live where you are? So I think just finding ways to really make this digestible. I think YIMBYism can get a bad, reputation for kind of being a bunch of guys that spend too much time on Twitter. And so I think, we have to find ways to talk to this, to the people in our lives that, aren't typically, plugged into politics, and find ways to talk about it in a way that, that makes sense to them. That, we want affordable childcare and affordable housing, and we have a path to actually get that done. Politicians make lots of promises, but, this is actually like a path forward to actually get some of those promises done.
Well, as a guy who spends too much time on Twitter and isn't even the most egregious one on this podcast, I would just say I think that's a Oh, Armand just made such a face, which also says that it's pretty clear he knows it's him. Elizabeth, I think that's such an important point, and it's something that we heard from the Secretary of Housing in Maryland on our first episode. That's Jake Day, and he said, look, what resonates both with voters and with elected officials is not talking about the policies, it's telling the stories, the personal anecdotes of how this touches your real lives. And we have a politician on the podcast. Burhan, I'm curious, in your work in Cambridge, both getting elected and after being elected, how you've done this, how you've translated YIMBY policies and abundance ideas into kitchen table issues and personal stories, both to communicate your intentions and values and what you believe, to persuade people who might be skeptical, to work with people and win the support of people who might have some opposition. How has this manifested in your career in Cambridge?
Yeah, that's a lot of fun. Let me start by building on what Armand said. I think that there's, and actually not what Armand said, what you said originally, Steve, which is, you talked about bringing this down to the level of millionaires. I would actually frame it a little bit differently, which is like, if you live in a city, right? Like whether it's San Francisco or Cambridge or New York or really any city in the dense core, like you will almost certainly benefit from upzoning, right? Like you're going from a place where you can have maybe a single family home, maybe a duplex, to having, 6, 8, 10, 12 apartments. That's going to bring up your land value, right? Even if rents go down, you'll just be able to build so many more units on there that it will be beneficial to you. I think that my take on it is that, I was born in Pakistan. And in general, when I visit there, but also many other low-income countries, people are desperate for growth, right? Because it means a better opportunity. And life is so difficult right now that you are willing to put up with the downsides of growth to have that better life at the end of that transformation, right? And I think that what's hard is that, Ross Douthat, who I don't actually like very much, but has this quote about like a decadent society. And I think about that sometimes, which is that being a progressive, why it's so hard is that you're talking about progress, but progress comes at the cost of the intermediate transitionary period. And I think that so much is not that people don't believe that building more housing will be good for housing prices down the line, or that it could even lead to a more vibrant city. It's that the intermediate times kind of sucks, right? When you're trying to figure out what new traffic patterns look like, and maybe you haven't built the new transit station yet, so you have a little bit more traffic. You're, building more housing, so you have to deal with construction and all that noise. And that so much of it is also just willing to put up with the downsides of growth for realizing that there's so much a better world and so much you're losing by refusing to get out of your comfort zone, and that progress is worth it in the end.
You've been listening to Radio Abundance. Join the movement for progressive abundance at yimbydemocrats.org. Yes, we can build again. Yes, we can trounce the fascists. Yes, you can be the difference. This is AI, by the way. You think these jokers actually got Obama? Check in with me in a few months. It'll happen.
Thank you for listening to Radio Abundance, a new podcast by YIMBY Democrats for America. Now it's time for you to join the movement. We're building a big tent, and it's going to take all of us. Join us, and together we'll fight to build America, defeat fascism, and unleash the era of progressive abundance. Join the movement at yimbydemocrats.org.
If people feel like democracy is failing, that it's too slow and doesn't deliver what they need, and that their lives are untenable and they can't afford housing and they can't afford groceries, they'll look to an alternative.
Democrats are figuring out that we've got to be a lot tougher and we've got to be a lot louder.
The world has changed in a short time. The thought that California could lose 4, maybe 5 congressional seats is a major problem. The fact that we are losing people from our state because of affordability obviously is not something that's acceptable.
We can have a future that is pro-progress, pro-development, pro-housing, that is more utopian than the one that we're in now, where everyone actually can live in a community or in a city or neighborhood where they have access to the things that they need.
Standing up for the rule of law, making sure that we have a presidential administration who doesn't break the law or violate the Constitution.
We want to ensure that every person in this country has access to a good neighborhood and a good home.
I also want to be the top housing cop, because we have laws that need to be followed. They will help us build the housing that we need here in California.
We can say yes to more housing. We can say yes to good transit. We can say yes to understanding the relationship between climate and housing.
There was a common sense in that, a beautiful embrace of us and we instead of I and me, our shared society, our common future. We need to build more housing for all of us. We're all going to rise together or not at all.
I think abundance is an optimistic perspective. It's very much about a future. It's very much about what liberals would love to see. Incredible space where we could all live kind of in harmony. And if we all had access to things that we need and want, particularly a roof and housing over our heads.
It's a new day. We need to build. It's good for all of us. We're all in this together. Let's all participate in the solution together to build enough housing for all of us.
It's going to be exciting when we look back and think of all the good work we're going to do here. So look forward to working with you guys.